My grandchildren ask me to write down the true stories, the ones that happened before their time, before the world got so crowded and loud. They want tales of gunfights and outlaws, I suppose, gold strikes and stampedes, the kind of adventures that make good telling around a fire, but I'll give them something different, something harder to believe. I'll tell them about Jacob Stone and Sarah Whitmore, about a winter that taught me more than 60 years of living had managed to teach. About love that doesn't care what the calendar says or what the neighbors whisper. I'm 78 years old now, writing this in the winter of 1899. My hands shake when I hold the pen. My eyes aren't what they were. The ranch that took 40 years to build feels too big some days, too empty. My sons run it now. I mostly just watch and remember. But some things you remember clear as snowmelt, even when everything else goes foggy, even when names slip away and faces blur together. The winter of 1889 was like that. I was 68 then, still strong enough to work, still sharp enough to know when something unusual was happening. And what happened that winter in the high country above Pine Ridge, that was unusual. That was something worth remembering. Let me start where I first heard about it. It was a November morning. I'd ridden down from my ranch to Pine Ridge for supplies. The settlement wasn't much, maybe 20 buildings scattered along a frozen creek. General store, saloon, boarding house, church. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, usually before that business even happens. I tied my horse outside Ezra Hawkins's store. The boards of the porch creaked under my boots. Inside smelled like coffee and flour and the wood-burning stove Ezra kept going all winter. Ezra was behind the counter talking to Eleanor Brennan. Eleanor ran the boarding house across the street. She was maybe 55 then, iron-gray hair pulled back tight, face that could be stern or kind depending on her mood. That morning she looked concerned. "A girl," Ezra was saying, "showed up yesterday asking directions to Jacob Stone's cabin." I stopped sorting through the tobacco selection. That caught my attention. "Jacob Stone?" I said. "You sure?" Ezra nodded, asked for him by name. Now, most folks reading this won't know who Jacob Stone was. That's fair, he kept to himself. Lived alone at 9,000 feet, up where the air gets thin and the winters kill you if you're not careful. I knew him because I'd been trading with him for near 20 years. Bought his pelts, sold him supplies, saw him maybe 4 times a year when he came down from the mountains. He wasn't friendly exactly, but he was fair, paid his debts, kept his word. That counts for something. But nobody went looking for Jacob Stone. He'd made it clear a long time ago he wanted to be left alone. "What kind of girl?" Eleanor asked. She had that tone women get when they're worried about someone young and vulnerable. "Young," Ezra said. "Mid-20s, I'd guess. Rode in on a horse that looked about done in. Said her name was Sarah Whitmore." The name meant nothing to me then. Should have, maybe. But I'd never been good with names. "I gave her directions," Ezra continued. "Tried to tell her it was a hard ride, especially with weather coming in. She thanked me and left." "That was yesterday afternoon," Eleanor frowned. "Did she say why she was looking for him?" "No, ma'am. Just said it was important." I bought my tobacco and coffee and headed out. The sky had that flat, gray-white look that means snow's coming. Heavy snow, the kind that seals the high country off from the world until spring decides to let go. If that girl had ridden up to Jacob's cabin yesterday, she was stuck there now. The pass would be closed within days. Maybe already was. I thought about it on the ride back to my ranch. Wondered what would make a young woman travel alone to find a hermit in the mountains. Wondered if Jacob would even let her in. Then I put it out of my mind. I had my own cattle to worry about, my own winter to prepare for. I didn't know then that what was happening up at 9,000 feet would change everything. For Jacob, for that girl, even for me, in ways I didn't expect. Sometimes the biggest changes start quiet. Just a girl on a tired horse riding through the first snow of winter. Let me tell you about Jacob Stone's cabin. I'd been there a handful of times over the years. Always impressed me, that cabin. Not fancy, but built right, built to last. It sat in a hollow where the wind couldn't reach it, but the sun could. Lodgepole pine logs, weathered to silver gray, fitted so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. Stone chimney rising from the center. Jacob had hauled those rocks himself, one by one. Roof pitched steep so snow would slide off. Behind the cabin, he'd built a lean-to against the rock face for his horses, 2 of them. A gelding named Sam and a paint mare called Bertie. They'd survived up there almost as long as he had. The cabin was 1 room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. Not much, but enough for a man alone. Bed in one corner, table and chairs made from lodgepole, shelves holding his few possessions. The hearth took up most of one wall. Had to. Up at that altitude, cold will kill you faster than hunger. Outside, a small corral, a workbench for skinning and stretching pelts, a woodpile that Jacob kept stacked higher than a man's head. He'd learned early that you don't wait until you need firewood to cut it. The cabin sat at the edge of a meadow. In summer, that meadow bloomed with wild flowers, purple lupine, red paintbrush, yellow arnica. In winter, it was just white, smooth and unmarked except for the tracks of animals crossing. Beyond the meadow the forest started, dense pine and spruce, dark green against the snow, and beyond that the peaks rose up sharp and clean, beautiful and deadly, like most things worth knowing. Jacob had chosen that spot careful, close enough to the creek for water, far enough from avalanche chutes to be safe, sheltered but with clear sight lines. A man could see someone coming from a long way off, which is why he knew about the rider before she arrived. Jacob woke that November morning the way he always did, before dawn, when the world was still quiet and belonged only to him. The cabin was cold enough that his breath misted in the darkness. He lay there a moment under the heavy bearskin, listening. The wind had died during the night. That meant snow was coming, the heavy kind that turned the peaks into fortresses no man could cross until spring decided to loosen its grip. He pushed himself up, feeling the familiar protest in his back and shoulders. 63 years old, and every one of them had left their mark. His feet found the cold floor. The hearth still had coals from the night before. Jacob stirred them back to life, added kindling. The wood caught quickly. He never let a fire die completely. Not up here, where cold could kill you before you realized you were in trouble. While the cabin warmed, he dressed in layers, wool long johns, canvas pants worn soft with age, a flannel shirt his wife had made him before she died, leather vest, boots lined with rabbit fur, quiet on the trap lines, warm enough for all but the worst days. His hair was silver now, past his shoulders. He tied it back with a leather cord. Cutting it seemed like unnecessary effort. The mirror above his wash basin showed him the face he'd grown accustomed to, weathered brown skin, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, beard gone pure white. But his eyes were still clear, pale blue like creek water. Margaret used to say they were the first thing she'd noticed about him. That was 40 years ago, before the cavalry, before they'd married, before they'd lost everything. Jacob pushed the memory away. That was the trick to surviving up here. You learned to lock the past in a room in your mind and only visit when you were strong enough to handle it. Most days he wasn't. He made coffee in a battered pot. The grounds were on their third use, but they still gave up some flavor. He fried cornmeal mush in bacon grease and ate standing by the window, looking out at the mountains that had become his whole world. The peaks were already white with early season snow, sharp against the pre-dawn sky, beautiful, deadly. After breakfast, he gathered his gear for the trap line, canvas pack, knife, hatchet, the Winchester rifle older than his time in these mountains. He kept it clean, and it had never failed him. Bears and mountain lions didn't care how old a man was. The rifle was the great equalizer. He stepped outside just as the sun broke over the eastern ridge. The cold hit him sharp and clean. His breath plumed in front of him. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 18 degrees. Mild for November at this altitude, the horses nickered from the lean-to. Jacob fed them hay from his small store, checked their water. They'd need to make a trip down to Pine Ridge before the deep snows came. Supplies were running low: flour, salt, coffee. The things a man couldn't make or trap for himself. Jacob spent the morning running his trap line. The circuit took him 3 hours through timber and along the creek. The first 3 traps were empty. The storm had kept the animals in their dens. The fourth held a marten, frozen solid, its dark fur perfect. Good pelt. He'd get a fair price when he went down to trade. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency. His hands worked even though they were numb with cold. This was the rhythm of his life. Trap, check, skin, cure. Trade, day after day, season after season, year after year. By the time he returned to the cabin, it was past noon. The sky had gone the flat gray-white that meant snow was close. Jacob skinned the marten on the workbench behind the cabin, scraped the hide clean, stretched it on a frame. The work was meditative, required attention but not thought. His mind could wander while his hands moved. He thought about Thomas Whitmore, which was unusual. Jacob tried not to think about the people he'd left behind when he'd come to the mountains, but Thomas had been on his mind lately. The boy had been barely 17 when Jacob had worked as foreman on the Walker Ranch in Wyoming. Eager kid, always trailing after Jacob, asking questions, wanting to learn everything about horses and cattle and the land. Jacob had been patient with him. The boy reminded him of the son he'd never had, might have had, if his daughter had lived, if Margaret hadn't died of the same fever that took their baby girl. He'd left the ranch suddenly. The grief finally too much to carry around other people. He'd simply packed his gear one morning and ridden into the mountains, looking for a place remote enough that memory couldn't follow. Thomas had been devastated, Jacob had heard later. But he'd hardened his heart to it. Better for the boy to learn early that people leave, that you can't count on anyone staying. That was 17 years ago. Thomas would be in his mid-30s now, if he'd lived. Probably had a family. A ranch of his own. Jacob hoped he'd done well. The boy had deserved better than to be abandoned by another person he'd trusted. He finished with the hide as the first snow began to fall, big flakes drifting down soft and slow. He carried the frame inside to cure near the fire, then set about making an early supper. Beans and salt pork, the same meal he'd eaten 1,000 times. He'd just sat down to eat when he heard it, the sound of a horse moving through the snow outside. Jacob froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. In 20 years, no one had come to his cabin uninvited. The few trappers and prospectors who worked this high country knew which valleys were his and stayed clear. Visitors meant trouble or tragedy. He wanted no part of either. Jacob set down his bowl, picked up the rifle, checked the load by feel. He moved to the window and looked out through the gap between the shutters. A single rider was approaching through the falling snow, leading their horse rather than riding it. Smart. The trail up to his cabin was treacherous, if you didn't know it. The figure was small, bundled in a heavy coat and hat. As they drew closer, Jacob realized with a start that it was a woman. His first thought was that she was lost, maybe separated from a party further down the mountain. His second thought was that she'd come a long way. The horse was exhausted, its head hanging low, its breath steaming in the cold air. The woman herself moved like someone at the end of their strength, each step deliberate and careful. Jacob watched her approach, his grip tightening on the rifle. She stopped 20 feet from the cabin, looked up at the structure with what seemed like relief. Then she called out, her voice clear despite the falling snow. "Mr. Stone? Jacob Stone." She knew his name. That changed everything. Jacob moved to the door, kept the rifle in his hand but pointed at the ground. He opened it and stepped out onto the small porch he'd built to keep snow from drifting against the door. "I'm Stone," he said. His voice sounded rusty. He rarely spoke aloud up here. "Who's asking?" The woman pushed back her hat. Jacob saw her face for the first time. Young, mid-20s at most, pretty in a practical way, strong features, dark eyes that looked right at him without flinching. Her cheeks were red with cold, her lips chapped. She'd been traveling hard. "My name is Sarah Whitmore," she said. "Thomas Whitmore was my father." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a door he'd thought locked forever rattling on its hinges. Thomas. This was Thomas's daughter. He could see it now. She had her father's eyes, his determined jaw. "Thomas," Jacob said quietly. It wasn't a question, just the name hanging in the cold air between them. "Yes, sir." Sarah took a step closer, her horse following obediently. "He passed 7 years ago, riding accident, but before he died he talked about you. He told me that if I ever needed help, if I ever needed to find someone who could teach me how to stand on my own, I should find Jacob Stone in the Colorado high country." Jacob's throat felt tight. 7 years. Thomas had been dead for 7 years, and he'd never known. The boy he'd mentored, the young man he'd left behind, gone. And this girl, this young woman, had spent years looking for him. "That's a long way to come," Jacob said finally. "And it's getting dark. There's weather moving in." "I know," Sarah said. "I've been riding for 2 weeks. I'm not going back down tonight." It wasn't a request. Jacob studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something in her that reminded him of himself at that age, a kind of determined desperation, the look of someone who'd run out of other options. "You can stable your horse with mine," he said, making a decision he knew he'd probably regret. "We'll talk inside where it's warm." Relief flooded Sarah's face, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you." Jacob led her around to the corral, showed her where to put her horse and gear. The animal was a good one, a sturdy roan mare that had been well cared for despite the hard journey. While Sarah unsaddled, Jacob forked out hay and broke the ice on the water trough. They worked in silence, the snow falling heavier now, building up on their shoulders and hats. When they finally entered the cabin, Sarah stopped just inside the door, looked around. Jacob tried to see it through her eyes, small, dim, sparse. One room with his bed in the corner. The table and chairs he'd made from lodgepole pine. Shelves holding his few possessions. The hearth taking up most of one wall. Pelts and hides hung from the rafters, drying. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and coffee. A hermit's den. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing to the table. "You hungry?" "Starving," Sarah admitted. She removed her coat and hat, revealed a simple dress underneath. Practical wool in dark blue. Her hair was brown, braided and pinned up. She sat at his table like she belonged there, which unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Jacob heated up the beans and pork, added more to the pot. He sliced bread he'd baked 2 days ago, hard now, but edible when soaked in the bean juice. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set everything on the table. Sarah ate like she meant it, not dainty, but not wasteful either. He found himself watching her hands, work-roughened, capable, her father's hands. "Tell me about Thomas," Jacob said when she'd taken the edge off her hunger. "How did it happen?" Sarah set down her spoon. "He was breaking a horse for a neighbor, 3-year-old stallion, mean-spirited. The horse threw him, and he hit his head on a fence post. He lived for 2 days, mostly unconscious, but there were moments when he was clear. That's when he talked about you." Jacob felt the old guilt rise up, familiar as an ache in his bones. "I should have stayed," he said. "Should have been there." "He never blamed you," Sarah said quickly. "He understood why you left. He told me about your wife, your daughter. He said you'd taught him that sometimes a man has to walk away from everything to save what's left of himself." The words hit harder than Jacob expected. He stood abruptly, moved to the window. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, already covering the ground in a thick blanket. "Why are you really here, Sarah?" he asked, his back to her. "Your father's been gone 7 years. Why now?" He heard her take a breath, gathering herself. "Because I'm running," she said simply, "and I don't have anywhere else to go." Jacob turned to face her. In the firelight, she looked younger and older at the same time, young enough to have a whole life ahead of her, old enough to have already seen too much of the world's hardness. "Running from what?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There were only so many things that sent young women into the mountains alone. "From a marriage I don't want," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "From a man who thinks he owns me because his family paid my debts. From a life that would kill me slower than any winter could." Jacob looked at this young woman, Thomas's daughter, sitting at his table, asking for his help. Every instinct told him to say no, to send her back down the mountain in the morning, to preserve the solitude he'd built so carefully over 20 years. He was too old, too set in his ways, too damaged to take responsibility for another human being. But there was another voice, quieter but insistent, the voice that remembered Thomas's eager face, the boy's loyalty and trust, the voice that knew what it meant to be desperate enough to ride 300 miles into the wilderness looking for hope. "You can stay until the snow melts," Jacob heard himself say. "That's 3, maybe 4 months. But when the pass clears, you'll need to decide what comes next. I can't fix your life for you." Sarah's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "I don't need you to fix anything," she said. "I just need time to figure out how to fix it myself. That's all I'm asking." Jacob nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Jacob replied. "Winter up here is harder than you can imagine. You might regret this choice before spring comes." Sarah smiled, a small, determined expression that reminded him so much of her father it hurt to look at. "I won't regret it," she said. "I've been waiting 7 years to find you, Mr. Stone. Whatever happens now, at least I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He moved to the corner where he kept his spare blankets and began making up a pallet near the fire. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to reconfigure the cabin for 2 people. Tonight, he'd give her the warmest spot and take the cold himself. It was the least he could do for Thomas's daughter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and steady, sealing them into the high country until spring decided to let them go. Jacob Stone had thought his story was finished, that the only chapters left were waiting and eventually dying alone in these mountains. But as he looked at Sarah Whitmore, curled up by his fire, already drifting into exhausted sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. That maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't quite finished after all. Now, I need to back up a piece here. Tell you some things about Jacob Stone that'll help you understand what happened next. I didn't know most of this then. Jacob wasn't the talking type. But over the years, pieces came out. Late nights in my barn when we'd shared whiskey. Quiet conversations after he'd married Sarah and softened some. I'll tell it to you now, the way he told it to me, the way I think it happened. Jacob Stone was born in 1826, Kansas Territory. His father was a farmer who couldn't make dirt grow anything but rocks. His mother died when Jacob was 12. Fever. He left home at 16, joined the cavalry at 18, served 10 years as a scout in the Indian Wars. That's where he learned to read sign, to move quiet, to survive in country that killed careless men. He was good at it. The officers respected him. The men trusted him. He saved his colonel's life once at a place called Wilson Creek, carried the man 3 miles with a bullet in his own shoulder. But war changes people. Jacob saw things no man should see, did things he didn't like to remember. When his enlistment was up in 1856, he didn't re-up. He drifted west, hired on with a ranching operation in Montana. That's where he met Margaret. She was the foreman's daughter, 26 years old, dark hair, gentle smile, but strong, not just in body but in spirit. She could look at a man and see right through any pretense, any lie he told himself. She saw Jacob, really saw him, and she loved him anyway. They married in 1857, had a small house on the ranch. Nothing fancy, but Margaret made it feel like a palace. In 1859, their daughter was born, Annie, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair like her mother, Jacob's pale blue eyes. Jacob said those were the happiest 18 months of his life. Then the fever came. It swept through that part of Montana in the winter of 1861. Started in town, spread to the ranches. Annie got sick first, 6 months old. There was nothing they could do. She died in Margaret's arms on a Tuesday morning. Margaret got sick 2 days later. Jacob nursed her for 3 days, bathed her with cool water, tried every remedy they knew, prayed to a God he wasn't sure was listening. Margaret died 3 days after Annie. Jacob buried them both on a hillside where Margaret used to like to sit and watch the sunset. Then he went a little crazy. He kept working, kept going through the motions, but inside he was hollow, empty. The part of him that could feel joy or hope or connection, it died with them on that hillside. He started drinking, stopped caring about anything. The ranch owner, a good man named Walker, tried to help, but Jacob was drowning and he didn't want to be saved. That went on for about a year. Then, in the spring of 1862, a new hand showed up at the ranch, Thomas Whitmore, 17 years old, eager as a puppy. Wanting to learn everything, he followed Jacob everywhere, asked 1,000 questions, wouldn't leave him alone, even when Jacob was cruel to him, which he was sometimes. Thomas just kept coming back, kept trying, and slowly, without meaning to, he gave Jacob a reason to get up in the morning, teaching him. Watching him grow, it helped. Jacob started drinking less, started caring again, just a little, started to think maybe he could survive this after all. Thomas was with him for about 7 years, growing from a boy into a man, getting better at everything he did. Jacob was proud of him, though he never said it out loud. But in 1869, Jacob felt himself getting attached, starting to care again, starting to love this boy like a son, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't risk loving someone and losing them again. So one morning in October 1869, Jacob just rode away, didn't say goodbye, didn't explain. Just vanished into the mountains where loss couldn't follow. Except it did follow, loss always does. It just took 20 years to catch up. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, still caught in the fog between sleep and waking, he thought he was back in Montana with Margaret. Then reality settled over him like cold water. Sarah Whitmore was sleeping by his fire, or had been sleeping. The sounds coming from his kitchen area made it clear she was awake and cooking. He sat up on his bed, every joint protesting. He'd given Sarah the warm spot by the fire and taken his usual place in the corner. At his age, a cold night left him stiff until he got moving. He pulled on his boots and stood, ran his hands through his hair. Sarah turned from the stove as he approached. She'd already dressed, her hair braided neatly. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I found the bacon and some eggs. Figured I should make myself useful." Jacob grunted, moved to the window. 2 feet of new snow had fallen overnight. Maybe more. The world outside was white and silent, the kind of quiet that only came after a heavy snow. They weren't going anywhere today. "You know how to cook," he observed, sitting at the table. "My father taught me everything he could before he died," Sarah said, bringing him a plate. "How to cook, hunt, track, read sign. He said a woman needed to know how to take care of herself, because the world wasn't kind to those who couldn't." Jacob ate in silence, thinking about Thomas teaching his daughter the same lessons Jacob had taught him. There was something both comforting and painful about that continuity. After breakfast, Sarah cleared the dishes without being asked. Jacob watched her move around his cabin, efficient and capable. She wasn't treating this like temporary shelter. She was already making herself at home. That should have bothered him more than it did. "We need to talk," Jacob said finally. "You said you're running from a marriage. I need to know the whole story." Sarah dried her hands on a towel and sat across from him. The morning light coming through the window made her look even younger. "His name is James Holloway," she began. "His father owns the biggest ranch in our part of Wyoming, 10,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, money and influence." "And the son wants you," Jacob said. "The son thinks he owns me," Sarah corrected. "After my father died, I had debts. The ranch was small. There'd been medical bills. I was managing, barely. But managing, she paused, gathering herself. Then my uncle showed up, my father's brother. I barely knew him. He'd left Wyoming years ago, hadn't even come to my father's funeral. Jacob could see where this was heading. He took over, Sarah continued. Said I was a woman alone, that I needed a man's guidance. He went to the Holloways, told them I was available for marriage. They offered to clear the debts in exchange for an arrangement. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Jacob could hear the anger underneath. I didn't find out until the papers were already signed. My uncle had forged my signature. That's not legal, Jacob said. Legal doesn't matter much when the other family has enough money to make it legal, Sarah replied. The Holloways paid $500 to clear my debts. In their eyes, they own me now. Jacob felt a cold anger settling in his gut. He'd seen this before. Powerful men treating women like property, like cattle to be bought and traded. So you left, he said. I fought first, Sarah said, and now there was something fierce in her eyes. I told James Holloway I'd never marry him, that I'd rather die alone. He grabbed me, tried to force a kiss. She paused. I broke his nose with the butt of my father's rifle. Despite himself, Jacob felt a flicker of approval. Bet that surprised him. It did. But it also made things worse. He left, but he promised he'd be back with the law. Said I'd assaulted him, that I was unstable. Sarah leaned forward. I knew I had to leave before they could lock me up or drag me to a church, so I spent the next month preparing. I sold what I could, packed what I needed, and I started riding. 300 miles, Jacob said, on the word of one old trapper and a rough map. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Sarah said simply, and my father trusted you more than anyone else in the world. He said you were the finest man he'd ever known, that you'd taught him what it meant to have honor. She met his eyes. I figured if I could find you, maybe you could help me figure out what to do next. Jacob stood and walked to the small shelf where he kept his few personal possessions. He reached behind a stack of books and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the tin-type photograph he'd taken the night Margaret and the baby died. He rarely looked at it anymore. The pain had dulled over the years, but never fully disappeared. He set the box on the table in front of Sarah. "Open it," he said. She did, carefully. Her breath caught when she saw the photograph. A younger Jacob, clean-shaven and clear-eyed, standing beside a beautiful woman holding an infant, wrapped in blankets. "Margaret and Annie," Jacob said quietly. "My wife and daughter. They died of fever 23 years ago. Annie was only 6 months old. Margaret went 3 days later. I buried them both on a hillside in Montana." Sarah touched the photograph gently. "I'm so sorry. I tried to keep working," Jacob continued, "to stay on the ranch. But everything reminded me of them. Every room, every corner, every sunset. I started drinking. Stopped caring about anything." He sat back down. "The ranch owner was a good man named Walker. He tried to help, but I was drowning and I didn't want to be saved. That's when your father showed up. 17 years old, eager as a puppy, wanting to learn everything." Jacob looked at Sarah. "He followed me everywhere, asked 1,000 questions, wouldn't leave me alone, even when I was cruel to him, which I was sometimes. He just kept coming back, kept trying." His voice roughened. "And slowly, without meaning to, he gave me a reason to get up in the morning. Teaching him. Watching him grow. It helped." "He loved you like a father," Sarah said softly. "I know," Jacob replied. "That's why I left. I could feel myself getting attached, starting to care again, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk loving someone and losing them again." He met her eyes. "So one morning, I just rode away, didn't say goodbye, didn't explain. Just vanished into these mountains where loss couldn't follow." "But it did follow," Sarah said. Jacob nodded slowly. "Yes, it just took 20 years to catch up." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled something out. She set it on the table between them. A small wooden horse, carved by hand, worn smooth with years of handling. Jacob felt his breath catch. He knew that horse. He'd carved it himself 17 years ago, during a slow afternoon on the ranch. Thomas had been pestering him about learning to work wood. So Jacob had shown him how to whittle. He'd made the horse as a demonstration, then given it to the boy. He carried this with him everywhere, Sarah said. Even when he got older, he kept it in his pocket. After he died, I found it in his things, along with a note. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, handed it to Jacob. His hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was Thomas's. A little shaky, probably written when he was dying. This horse was made by the best man I ever knew. If you need help, find Jacob Stone. He'll know what to do. Jacob picked up the wooden horse with trembling hands. It was rough work, the proportions slightly off, the mane too thick. But he remembered making it, remembered Thomas's face when he'd handed it over. The boy's eyes had lit up like Jacob had given him gold. I don't know what to do, Jacob admitted, his voice rough. I don't know how to help you, Sarah. I'm just an old man hiding in the mountains. You're more than that, Sarah said firmly. You're the man my father trusted above everyone else. You're the reason I rode 300 miles through late-season weather. You're my last hope. The words hung in the air between them. Jacob wanted to deny them, to send her away, to retreat back into his comfortable solitude. But looking at Thomas's daughter, holding the wooden horse he'd carved so long ago, he found he couldn't do it. The Holloways will come looking for you, Jacob said finally. If you're worth $500 to them, they won't just let you disappear. I know, Sarah said. I've been watching my back trail. I don't think they've found me yet, but they will eventually. Then we deal with it when they come, Jacob said. Until then, we prepare. I'll teach you what I can. How to survive up here, how to take care of yourself. When spring comes, we'll figure out your next step. He looked at her seriously. But Sarah, I can't promise anything beyond that. I'm not the man your father thought I was. I'm just someone who learned how to survive alone. That's exactly what I need to learn, Sarah said. How to survive, how to stand on my own, how to be strong enough that no one can ever own me. Jacob nodded slowly. Then that's what I'll teach you. But it won't be easy. Winter up here breaks people who aren't ready for it. I'm ready, Sarah said with quiet conviction. Looking at her, Jacob wasn't sure if she was or not, but he recognized the determination in her voice. It was the same determination that had carried him into these mountains 20 years ago and kept him alive ever since. Maybe Thomas's daughter had inherited more than his eyes and jawline. Maybe she'd inherited his strength too. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Jacob woke Sarah before dawn each morning, showed her how he built up the fire, the precise arrangement of kindling and logs that would burn hot enough to cook on but not waste precious wood. Then he demonstrated his method of making coffee, grounds measured carefully, water from the barrel he'd filled before the snow came. Boiled just long enough to extract the flavor without making it bitter. We checked the traps first, Jacob explained that first morning. Every day, no matter the weather, an animal left too long in a trap suffers, and the pelt can be ruined by scavengers. How far is the trap line? Sarah asked. 3 hours round trip on a good day, longer in deep snow. He studied the sky through the window. Today will be longer. We got 2 feet last night, and there's more coming. They dressed in layers. Sarah borrowed one of Jacob's extra coats, which hung large on her smaller frame. He gave her a pair of snowshoes he'd made years ago but rarely used. They were too small for his feet but fit Sarah well enough. Stay behind me, Jacob instructed as they stepped outside. Step where I step. The drifts hide deadfall and holes. A broken ankle up here is a death sentence. Sarah nodded seriously. The morning was brutal in its beauty. The sun hadn't yet cleared the peaks, leaving the valley in blue-gray shadow. Their breath plumed in the frigid air. The only sound was the crunch of snow under their snowshoes, and the occasional crack of a tree branch releasing its burden of ice. Jacob led them along the trap line he'd established years ago, each trap carefully placed near game trails or water sources. The first 3 traps were empty. The storm had kept the animals in their dens. The 4th held a marten, frozen solid, its dark fur perfect. Watch, Jacob said. He showed Sarah how to remove the animal without damaging the pelt, how to reset the trap exactly as it had been. "You're not just taking from these mountains," he explained. "You're part of them. Respect that." Sarah watched intently, asked questions that showed she was thinking, not just memorizing. How did he know where to place the trap? How could he tell if a trail was active or abandoned? What other signs should she look for? Jacob found himself slipping into the rhythm of teaching, something he hadn't done since Thomas. There was satisfaction in passing on knowledge, in watching understanding dawn in someone else's eyes. They were checking the sixth trap when it happened. Jacob had just reset the mechanism when he heard the ice crack. He turned. Sarah had wandered closer to the creek, curious about something. The snow was thinner there, the ice underneath deceptive. "Sarah, get back!" The ice gave way. She went through with a gasp, into water so cold it stopped your heart. Jacob moved without thinking. Years of cavalry training taking over, he ran to the edge, dropped flat on the solid ice, reached out. "Grab my hand!" Sarah was thrashing, the cold stealing her breath, her eyes wide with shock and fear, but she didn't panic. She reached for him, their hands locked. Jacob pulled, using all his strength, digging his elbows into the ice for leverage. Sarah came up, gasping, soaked. He dragged her onto solid ground, then grabbed her and ran. Back toward the cabin, 1.5 miles, through deep snow, at 63 years old. He didn't think about it, just ran. Sarah stumbled beside him, already shaking, lips turning blue. They burst into the cabin. Jacob stripped off her wet clothes, no time for modesty. Hypothermia could kill her in minutes. He wrapped her in the bearskin from his bed, set her by the fire, built it up until it roared. Then he made her drink hot coffee, sweetened with the last of his sugar. Slowly the shaking stopped. Color returned to her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I wasn't paying attention. I almost—" "You're alive," Jacob interrupted. "That's what matters." He sat back, suddenly aware that his own hands were shaking. He'd almost lost her, Thomas's daughter. 3 days after she'd arrived, almost lost her to the same mountains that had sheltered him for 20 years. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, wrapped in his bearskin, hair wet and plastered to her head, eyes huge in her pale face. She could have died, should have died, but she was alive because he'd been there, because he'd acted, because for the first time in 20 years he'd cared enough about another person to risk himself. "You did good," he said finally. "You didn't panic. You reached for my hand. A lot of people freeze in that situation, can't think, can't act. You kept your head." I was terrified. "Being terrified and staying calm aren't opposite things," Jacob said. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." He paused. "Your father taught me that." Sarah managed a small smile. He used to say the same thing. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the cabin warm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them in, protecting them from the world, or trapping them, depending on how you looked at it. "Jacob," Sarah said. It was the first time she'd used his name, not Mr. Stone, just Jacob. "Yes?" "I meant what I said about being ready for this, for whatever winter throws at me." "I know you did. But I'm also scared. Of the cold, of making mistakes, of—" She trailed off. "Of what?" "Of being a burden. Of you regretting letting me stay." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "I won't lie to you, Sarah. I didn't want company. I'd gotten comfortable being alone. Having you here, it changes things, makes them harder in some ways." He looked at the fire. "But I made a promise to your father. I didn't keep it the first time. I left when he needed me. I won't make that mistake again." "You don't owe him anything." "I owe him everything," Jacob said. "He gave me back my life when I'd given up on it. The least I can do is help his daughter when she needs it." Sarah reached out, placed her hand on his. "Thank you." Her hand was warm now, small but strong. Jacob looked down at it, at her fingers resting on his weathered, scarred knuckles. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't pull away from human touch. He let her hand rest there, finding comfort in the simple connection. "Get some rest," he said. "You've had enough adventure for one day." Sarah nodded, still wrapped in the bearskin. She curled up by the fire. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her. She slept. Jacob sat at the table, watching her, thinking about Thomas, about Margaret and Annie, about all the years he'd spent alone in these mountains, running from loss, from connection, from the possibility of caring about anyone again. And now here was Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's daughter, wrapped in his bearskin, sleeping by his fire, changing everything just by being here. The wooden horse sat on the shelf where he'd placed it, rough and worn and precious. A connection across 17 years, across life and death, across all the miles and all the grief. If you need help, find Jacob Stone. Thomas's last words to his daughter, his last act of faith in the man who'd abandoned him. Jacob picked up the horse, held it in his scarred hands. "I won't fail her," he said quietly, speaking to Thomas, to the memory, to the ghost that hung over this cabin. "I promise you that. I'll teach her what you wanted her to learn. I'll keep her safe. And when spring comes, I'll make sure she has the strength to face whatever comes next." The fire crackled. Outside the wind picked up, howling through the peaks. Jacob Stone sat in his cabin, not alone anymore. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. Maybe both. Probably both. He set the wooden horse back on the shelf. Tomorrow he'd continue teaching Sarah, continue preparing her for the hard months ahead. Tonight, he'd just sit here, listen to her quiet breathing, watch the fire, and remember what it felt like to have a purpose beyond simple survival. It felt good. It felt dangerous. It felt like the beginning of something he didn't quite understand yet. But whatever it was, it had started, and there was no going back now. 3 weeks passed. I didn't see Jacob or the girl during that time. The pass was closed, the high country sealed off from the world, but I thought about them up there, wondered how they were managing. A hermit who'd lived alone for 20 years, suddenly sharing his small cabin with a young woman. That couldn't be easy, not for either of them. I was about to find out just how complicated it was getting, but first, let me tell you what was happening up at 9,000 feet. Jacob told me most of this later, over whiskey and firelight. The parts he didn't tell me, Sarah did. And the parts neither of them said out loud, I could read between the lines. Sometimes you know a thing without being told. The days fell into rhythm. Jacob woke Sarah before dawn. They checked the traps together now. She'd learned the route, knew where each one sat, could reset them herself, though Jacob still watched to make sure she did it right. She was getting stronger. The work was hard, but she didn't complain. Jacob noticed the change in her, the way she moved through the snow with more confidence, the way her hands worked the traps without hesitation. Thomas had been like that too, quick learner, determined. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Jacob taught her other things, how to read weather in the clouds, how to tell a deer track from an elk, which plants would keep scurvy away come spring. Sometimes Sarah read aloud from a book of poems she'd brought. Jacob would never have admitted it, but he liked listening to her voice, the way she made the words sound alive. My father loved poetry, Sarah explained one night. He said it reminded him that there was beauty in the world, even when things were hard. Jacob thought about that. He'd spent 20 years focused only on survival, on enduring from one day to the next. He'd forgotten about beauty, about anything beyond the simple mechanics of staying alive. One morning in early December, they found a fox in the trap line. Beautiful red fur, thick and perfect for the winter cold. Your turn, Jacob said. Sarah had watched him skin animals a dozen times now, but she'd never done it herself. She knelt beside the frozen carcass, drew her knife, made the first careful cut. Jacob watched without comment. Let her work through it. She was slow, methodical, made a few mistakes, but nothing that ruined the pelt. When she finished, she looked up at him, pride and something else in her eyes, a kind of fierce satisfaction. I did it, she said simply. You did, Jacob agreed. They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence. The sun was up now, painting the peaks in shades of pink and gold. The cold was sharp but clean. Sarah stopped suddenly, looking out at the vista. It's beautiful, she said. Jacob followed her gaze. He'd seen this view 1,000 times, 10,000, but looking at it through her eyes, he saw it fresh. The way the light caught the snow, the dark green of the pines against white, the sky so blue it hurt. Yes, he said, it is. They stood there together, just breathing, just being. It was a small moment, nothing dramatic. But Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a kind of contentment he hadn't known in decades. He wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something else, something he wasn't ready to name yet. That night, Sarah asked the question Jacob had been dreading. They were sitting by the fire. She was mending a tear in her dress. Jacob was working on a new snowshoe frame. Tell me about when you knew my father, Sarah said. He talked about you, but I want to hear your side. Jacob's hand stilled on the wood. Not much to tell, he said. I don't believe that. Jacob looked at her. She was watching him with those dark eyes, Thomas's eyes. He set down the snowshoe frame. Your father was 17 when we met, he began slowly. Spring of 1862. He showed up at the Walker Ranch in Wyoming looking for work. Skinny kid, all elbows and enthusiasm. Sarah smiled. That sounds like him. He followed me everywhere, Jacob continued. Asked 1,000 questions. Wanted to learn everything at once. How to rope. How to break horses. How to read the land. He paused, remembering. I wasn't patient then. Wasn't kind. I was drinking too much. Hurting too much. But Thomas, he didn't care. He just kept coming back. What changed? Sarah asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. One day he asked me to teach him to whittle. Said his hands were too rough for delicate work, but he wanted to try. So I showed him. Made this little horse as an example. He gestured to the wooden horse sitting on the shelf. His face lit up like I'd given him something precious. And I realized this boy needed someone to believe in him, to teach him, to care whether he succeeded or failed. Jacob's voice roughened. And I needed someone to need me, to give me a reason to get up in the morning. We saved each other, I think, for a while. Then why did you leave? Sarah asked gently. Jacob stood, moved to the window. Outside the stars were brilliant in the cold darkness. Because I started to love him, he said. Like a son, like the son I'd never had. And I couldn't handle it, couldn't risk that kind of loss again. He turned to face her. So I ran, like a coward, left before I could get hurt, left before he could leave me. But he would never have left you, Sarah said. I know that now, but fear doesn't listen to reason. Sarah set down her mending, stood and moved to join him at the window. He understood, she said. That's what you need to know. He told me once that you'd taught him the most important lesson of his life, that sometimes a man has to walk away from everything to save what's left of himself. Jacob felt his throat tighten. He said that? He did. He said you were the bravest man he'd ever known, not because you stayed and fought, but because you knew when to retreat, when to protect yourself, even if it meant disappointing people. Jacob had to look away. I don't deserve his forgiveness. Maybe not, Sarah said, but you have it anyway. They stood together in the darkness, the cabin warm behind them, the mountains cold and vast beyond the glass. I have something to tell you, Sarah said, about how my father died. Jacob waited. It wasn't just a riding accident, not really. Sarah's voice was steady, but he could hear the emotion underneath. The horse he was breaking, it wasn't for a neighbor. It was for himself. He bought it specifically because the seller said nobody could break it. That it had thrown 3 cowboys already. Jacob felt ice slide down his spine. No. My father said Jacob Stone taught me that if something seems impossible, that's just another word for challenging. He bought that horse to prove he could do what others couldn't. Jacob turned to face her, horror dawning. He was trying to make you proud, Sarah said, even though you'd been gone 17 years, even though you weren't there to see it. He was still trying to be the man you taught him to be. Jacob felt the world tilt. "I killed him," he whispered. "No. I put that stubbornness in him, that need to prove himself. I killed him as surely as if I'd pushed him into that fence myself." Sarah grabbed his arms, made him look at her. "He made his own choices. You taught him to be brave. That's not the same as teaching him to be reckless." "Isn't it?" Jacob's voice was raw. "I taught him never to back down, never to quit. Always push harder." "You taught him to have courage," Sarah said firmly. "What he did with that courage was his decision." Jacob pulled away, moved to the corner where he kept his few precious things. The box with Margaret's photograph, the wooden horse. He picked up the horse, held it in his trembling hands. "Before he died," Sarah said quietly, "in those 2 days when he was barely conscious, he talked about you. Do you want to know what he said?" Jacob couldn't speak, just nodded. He said, "I hope Jacob knows I tried. I hope he knows I listened. I hope he'd be proud." Something broke inside Jacob then. The wall he'd built around his grief, around his guilt, around all the love he'd refused to let himself feel for 20 years, it cracked, shattered, fell away. He sat down heavily at the table, the wooden horse still clutched in his hands, and for the first time since he'd buried Margaret and Annie on that Montana hillside, Jacob Stone cried. Not quietly, not with dignity. He sobbed like a man who'd held in 2 decades of grief and couldn't hold it any more. Sarah knelt beside him, put her arms around him, held him while he broke. "I'm sorry," Jacob gasped. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I should have been there. Should have told you that you didn't need to prove anything. Should have told you I was already proud." "He knew," Sarah said. "Somehow he knew." Jacob cried until he had nothing left, until he was empty and exhausted and raw. When he finally stopped, Sarah was still there, still holding him. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "For what?" "For telling me, for not letting me keep running from it." Sarah pulled back, looked at him with those eyes that saw everything. "You're done running now," she said. It wasn't a question. Jacob wiped his face with his rough hands, looked at this young woman who'd ridden 300 miles to find him, who'd trusted him when she had no reason to, who'd just watched him fall apart and hadn't turned away. "Yes," he said, "I'm done running. Now, I need to tell you what was happening down in Pine Ridge during those weeks. Because while Jacob and Sarah were up in the mountains learning to trust each other, the rest of the world hadn't stopped turning, and some parts of that world were looking for Sarah Whitmore. It started about 10 days after she'd arrived at Jacob's cabin. 2 men rode into Pine Ridge on a cold December morning, well-dressed for travel, good horses, money in their pockets. They stopped at Ezra's store first. "We're looking for someone," the first man said. He was maybe 30, scar across his left cheek, eyes that didn't smile. "Young woman, mid-20s, riding alone, would have come through here about 2 weeks ago." Ezra looked up from his ledger. "Lot of people pass through." This one was asking about Jacob Stone. Ezra's face went neutral, the way mountain folks' faces do when strangers ask questions they don't like. "Don't recall." The second man put a gold coin on the counter. "Your memory might improve." Ezra looked at the coin, then back at the men. "I sell supplies, not information about my neighbors." The first man smiled. It wasn't friendly. "We're working for James Holloway, Wyoming ranching family. Maybe you've heard of them?" "Can't say I have." "Well, they're powerful people. The kind who remember friends and enemies." The man tapped the gold coin. "Question is, which one do you want to be?" Ezra picked up the coin, looked at it, then set it back on the counter. "I don't want to be either one. I want you to buy what you need and ride on." The men exchanged glances. "We'll be back," the first one said, "and next time we might not be so polite." They left. Ezra waited until they were gone. Then he pulled on his coat and walked across the street to Eleanor's boarding house. Eleanor was in her kitchen, making bread, flour on her hands, and apron. "We've got trouble," Ezra said. He told her about the men, the questions, the veiled threats. Eleanor's face went hard. "How much do they know?" "Just that a girl came through asking about Jacob. They don't know if she found him. Don't know if she's still up there." "Good," Eleanor said. "Let's keep it that way. What if they start asking around? Someone might talk." "Then we make sure someone talks to them first, someone we trust." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. "Get Clayton. We need to have a conversation." That's how I got pulled into this. I was at my ranch when Ezra rode up, told me everything. About the girl, Sarah, about the men looking for her, about the gold coins and the threats. "Jacob know about this?" I asked. "No way to tell him. Pass is closed." I thought about it. Thought about Jacob up there with a girl he barely knew, about men with money and bad intentions looking for her. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Eleanor wants to meet. Figure out what we're going to do when those men come back." We met that evening at Eleanor's, just the three of us. Eleanor poured coffee and we sat around her kitchen table like we were planning a church social instead of how to protect a fugitive. "First thing," Eleanor said, "we need to know if Sarah Whitmore has any legal protection, any guardianship or claim that supersedes whatever arrangement was made." "You think she does?" I asked. "I know she does." Eleanor stood and went to her office, came back with a document. "Thomas Whitmore filed this with me 15 years ago, named me as guardian for his daughter in the event of his death." She set the paper on the table. "Any arrangement made by her uncle without my consent is invalid." Ezra whistled low. "Does the girl know?" "I don't think so. Thomas filed it when he stayed here one winter." Eleanor paused. "We were close. He wanted to make sure Sarah would be protected if anything happened to him." I looked at Eleanor with new understanding. There was more to that story. But it wasn't my business. "This changes things," I said. "If you're her legal guardian and you approve of her staying with Jacob—" "I do approve," Eleanor said firmly. "From what Ezra told me, she rode 300 miles alone to find safety. That takes courage. And Jacob Stone is a decent man, whatever people might whisper." "People are already whispering," Ezra said. "You know how it is. Young woman, old man, alone in the mountains all winter." "Let them whisper," Eleanor said. "What matters is the law. And the law says Sarah Whitmore is under my guardianship. She's staying with Jacob Stone to learn wilderness skills. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me and the territorial marshal." I found myself liking Eleanor Brennan even more than I already did. "So what do we do when those men come back?" I asked. "We tell them enough truth to make them go away," Eleanor said. "Yes, a girl came through. Yes, she was looking for someone. No, we don't know if she found him. The weather closed in. Could be she's still up there. Could be she turned back. Could be a lot of things. And if they don't believe us, then we make it clear they're not welcome here. Mountain folks take care of their own. Sarah Whitmore is ours now, whether she knows it or not." The men came back 3 days later. This time they brought friends, 5 men total, riding into Pine Ridge like they owned the place. I was in the general store when they arrived, saw them through the window, recognized the 2 from before. The others looked like hired muscle. The leader, the one with the scar, tied his horse and came inside. The others waited on the street. "Afternoon," he said to Ezra. Pleasant enough, but there was steel underneath. "Afternoon," Ezra replied. "We were here last week, asking about a girl." "I remember." "Well, we've been asking around, and we heard some interesting things." The man leaned on the counter. "Heard she did come through here. Heard she was asking about Jacob Stone. Heard she headed up into the high country right before the big snow." Ezra didn't say anything. "So the question is," the man continued, "is she still up there, with him?" I couldn't say. Couldn't or won't. The door opened. Eleanor walked in. She'd timed it perfect, knowing the confrontation was coming. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cold and polite, "I understand you're looking for Sarah Whitmore." The scarred man turned, sized her up. "That's right. And you are?" "Eleanor Brennan. I run the boarding house. More importantly, I'm Sarah Whitmore's legal guardian." That stopped him. "Guardian?" Eleanor pulled out the document, set it on the counter where everyone could see it. "Filed with the territorial court 15 years ago by her father, Thomas Whitmore. Any arrangement made without my consent is legally invalid." The man's eyes narrowed. He read the document. Couldn't find fault with it. "Her uncle signed a contract." "Her uncle had no legal authority," Eleanor interrupted. "I do, and I approve of Sarah's current situation completely." "Which is what exactly?" "She's learning wilderness survival skills from an experienced mountain man, preparing herself to manage independently. A young woman should know how to take care of herself." "Alone with a man twice her age?" "I trust Jacob Stone's character completely, and Sarah is of legal age. She makes her own choices." The man's face hardened. "Mr. Holloway won't accept this." "Mr. Holloway doesn't have a choice," Eleanor said. "If he wants to contest the guardianship, he can take it to court. Until then, Sarah Whitmore is exactly where she has every legal right to be." The man stared at her for a long moment, trying to decide if she was bluffing. She stared right back. Not bluffing at all. "This isn't over," he finally said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I expect it's just beginning. But you should know something. Mountain folks protect their own, and Sarah Whitmore is one of ours now." The man looked around, saw Ezra watching, saw me watching, probably noticed the other folks who drifted closer, casually. But there, he was outnumbered. Not physically, not yet, but in the way that mattered up here. "We'll be in touch," he said. He walked out, mounted his horse. The 5 of them rode south, back toward Willow Creek. Eleanor waited until they were out of sight. Then she let out a breath. "That could have gone worse," Ezra said. "It's not finished," I said. "Those men work for someone with money and pride. That's a dangerous combination." "I know," Eleanor said, "but at least now we've drawn a line, made it clear they can't just take her." "What about Jacob?" I asked. "He needs to know what's coming." "No way to reach him until the pass clears," Ezra said. "Then we wait," Eleanor said, "and we hope that when trouble comes, Jacob's ready for it." Up at the cabin, Jacob and Sarah had no idea what was brewing down below. They were focused on their own small world, the daily rhythms of survival, the slow building of trust, and something else, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge yet. It started with small things, the way Jacob's hand would linger when he helped Sarah over a difficult patch of snow, the way Sarah's eyes would follow Jacob when he moved around the cabin, the way they'd both grown comfortable with silences that used to feel awkward. One evening in mid-December, Jacob cut his hand badly while splitting wood. The axe glanced off a frozen knot, bit deep into the meat of his palm. He wrapped it quickly, tried to hide how deep it was, but Sarah saw the blood seeping through the cloth. "Let me see," she said. "It's fine." "Jacob, let me see." He sat at the table, unwrapped the hand. Sarah winced. It was bad. Deep cut across the palm. Bleeding freely. "I need to clean this," she said, "and stitch it. I can do it myself." "With one hand? Don't be ridiculous." She heated water, found Jacob's needle and thread, the same needle he used for repairing leather. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "I know." Sarah cleaned the wound. Jacob didn't flinch, just watched her face as she worked. She was concentrating. Her bottom lip caught between her teeth. Dark eyes, focused. Beautiful, Jacob thought. Then immediately pushed the thought away. She was young enough to be his daughter, Thomas's daughter, for God's sake. But the thought had been there. Couldn't be unthought. Sarah threaded the needle, made the first stitch. Jacob's hand twitched. He couldn't help it. "Sorry," Sarah murmured. "I'm trying to be gentle." "You're doing fine." 3 more stitches. Sarah's hands were steady. "Sure." "Where'd you learn this?" Jacob asked, partly to distract himself from the pain, partly because he was genuinely curious. "My father. He said a woman needs to know how to patch people up. Men are idiots who hurt themselves." Jacob gave a short laugh. He wasn't wrong. Sarah smiled, finished the last stitch, tied it off. "There, keep it clean. Change the bandage daily." Her hands were still on his, holding his palm steady. Neither of them moved. The fire crackled. The wind outside whispered against the cabin walls. Sarah looked up, met Jacob's eyes. Something passed between them, something electric, dangerous. Sarah pulled her hands back quickly. "You should rest," she said, standing, moving away. "Sarah, I'll clean up." She turned away, started gathering the medical supplies. Jacob watched her, saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she wouldn't look at him. He'd felt it too, that moment of connection, of awareness, and it terrified him. She was 40 years younger than him, his student, Thomas's daughter. This couldn't happen. He wouldn't let it happen. "Thank you," he said, "for the stitching." "You're welcome." Her voice was carefully neutral. They didn't speak of it again. But something had changed between them. A line had been crossed, or maybe just acknowledged. Either way, the cabin felt smaller after that night, the silences more charged. Jacob lay in his bed that night, hand throbbing, mind racing. He looked at the wedding ring he still wore, Margaret's ring. He'd never taken it off in 23 years. A promise, a reminder, a chain. He wasn't ready to remove it. But for the first time, he wondered if maybe someday he might be. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Neither of them mentioned the day. Jacob didn't celebrate it anymore, hadn't since Margaret and Annie died. But Sarah made an effort. She used the last of their dried apples to make a pie. It was lopsided and slightly burned, but it tasted like heaven. "Merry Christmas," she said, setting it on the table. Jacob looked at the pie, at her hopeful face. "Merry Christmas," he replied. They ate it together, sweet and warm in the cold cabin. It was a small thing, but it mattered. After dinner, Sarah pulled out a piece of fabric she'd been working on. Sewing something in the evenings when she thought Jacob wasn't watching. She handed it to him. Shy. It was a new shirt, made from cloth she'd brought with her. Simple work, but careful. The stitches even and strong. "Your old one's wearing out," she said. "I thought—" Jacob held the shirt, ran his fingers over the seams. No one had made him clothes since Margaret. "Thank you," he said, voice rough. Thank you." He didn't have anything to give her, hadn't thought to prepare, but he went to his shelf, pulled down a small carving he'd been working on in the evenings. A bird, a jay, bright and defiant. "I saw you watching them," he said. "The jays that come to steal scraps from the horses. You said they reminded you of yourself, stubborn and loud." Sarah took the carving, turned it in her hands. The detail was remarkable, every feather carved with care. "It's beautiful," she said. "Jacob, I didn't know you could. Your father asked me to teach him once. Wood carving. I made that horse to show him how. This," he gestured to the jay. "This I made for you." Sarah's eyes glistened. "Thank you." They stood there, gifts in hand, the fire warm between them. It was the best Christmas Jacob had had in 2 decades, and the most dangerous, because with each passing day, with each small kindness, with each shared silence and knowing look, he was falling. Falling for Thomas's daughter. Falling in love at 63, when he'd thought that part of his life was over forever, and he had no idea what to do about it. Early January brought a cold snap, the kind that made your lungs ache when you breathed. That froze your eyelashes if you stayed outside too long. Jacob woke one morning to find frost on the inside of the windows, despite the fire burning all night. "Stay inside today," he told Sarah. "It's too cold." But by mid-morning, they heard a sound that made them both go still. Wolves. Howling. Close. Jacob grabbed his rifle, moved to the window, a pack of them, 6 or 7, circling the corral where Sam and Bertie stood terrified. "They're after the horses," Jacob said. He couldn't let that happen. Without the horses, they couldn't get down the mountain come spring, couldn't haul supplies, couldn't survive. "I'm going out," he said, "not alone." "Sarah, not alone," she repeated, grabbing her father's rifle, the one she'd brought with her. Jacob looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes. "Stay behind me. If I say run, you run. Back to the cabin. Bar the door." "I will." They stepped out into the brutal cold. The wolves turned, yellow eyes fixed on the 2 humans. Jacob raised his rifle, fired a shot into the air. The pack scattered, but didn't run far. They circled, waiting, hungry enough to be bold, desperate enough to risk humans. Jacob fired again, this time aiming near the alpha, close enough to scare, not close enough to hit. He didn't want to kill them if he didn't have to. They were just trying to survive. Like everything else up here. The alpha snarled, made a decision. The pack retreated. Into the trees. Gone. For now. Jacob lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the cold. Inside, he said. They stumbled back into the cabin, shut the door, stood by the fire. Sarah's teeth were chattering, her face pale. Jacob realized she was shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline, from fear she'd hidden while they were outside. "Hey," he said softly, "we're okay. I thought, when they looked at us, I thought, I know." Without thinking, Jacob pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, pressed against his chest, still shaking. He held her, one hand on her back, the other cradling her head. "You did good," he murmured. "You stayed calm. You had my back, that's all that matters." Sarah's arms came around him, holding tight. They stood like that for a long moment, just breathing, just being alive. When Sarah finally pulled back, there were tears on her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't." "Don't apologize. Fear is natural. You were brave when it counted. That's what matters." Sarah wiped her eyes, tried to smile. "My father used to say that." "I know. I taught him." Something flickered in Sarah's expression. A realization. "You loved him," she said. "Really loved him." "Yes." "And you love me." Jacob went still. "Sarah, not like you loved him. Different. But you do, don't you?" Jacob couldn't speak, couldn't deny it, because she was right. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, he'd fallen in love with Sarah Whitmore, not despite her being Thomas's daughter, but partly because of it. She had his courage, his kindness, his stubborn refusal to quit, but she was also herself, strong and fierce and beautiful and achingly alive. And Jacob, who'd thought his heart was dead, had fallen completely. "I'm 63 years old," he said finally. "You're young enough to be my granddaughter. Whatever this is, it can't happen." "Why not?" "Because I'll die before you're 40. Because the world will judge us. Because you're afraid," Sarah interrupted. "Not of dying. Of living. Of letting yourself feel something again." Jacob couldn't argue, because she was right. "Your father trusted me to protect you," he said. "Not to love me?" "Yes." Sarah stepped closer, looked up at him with those dark eyes that saw everything. "What if that's exactly what he wanted? What if he sent me to you, knowing I might fall in love with you, knowing you might fall in love with me?" "That's insane." "Is it?" "My father knew you better than anyone. He knew what you'd lost, what you'd been running from. He knew I'd need someone strong, someone who'd already survived the worst, someone who could teach me to survive too." She reached up, touched Jacob's face, her hand warm against his cold cheek. "He gave me the wooden horse and told me to find you. Maybe he was giving us both a second chance." Jacob wanted to pull away, to maintain the distance that was safe, but he couldn't. He covered her hand with his, held it against his face. "I'm too old," he whispered. "You're alive. That's all that matters. I'm broken. So am I. Maybe we can be broken together." Jacob closed his eyes. "I can't promise you a future. I can't promise I'll be here in 5 years, 10 years. Then promise me now, today, this moment." Jacob opened his eyes, looked at this woman who'd ridden 300 miles through snow to find him, who'd faced wolves and cold and loneliness without complaint, who'd held him while he cried and never judged him for it, who was offering him something he'd thought he'd never have again: love. "Sarah," she rose on her toes, kissed him, soft, gentle, a question. Jacob hesitated for only a moment. Then he kissed her back, and for the first time in 20 years, Jacob Stone let himself feel hope. I found out later that was the day everything changed up in that cabin. The day Jacob stopped running and Sarah stopped hiding. The day they chose each other, despite every reason not to. But down in Pine Ridge we were dealing with our own troubles, because the men had come back. And this time, they'd brought more than threats. I was in town when it happened. January 15th. Cold day. Clear sky. 8 riders came up the main street. Not the 5 from before. 8. And leading them was a man I recognized from descriptions. Young, well-dressed even for the trail. Handsome in that polished way rich men's sons often are. Except for the crooked nose, broken and healed badly. James Holloway himself. He dismounted in front of Eleanor's boarding house, stood there, waiting. Eleanor came out onto her porch, wiped her hands on her apron, faced him like a general facing an army. "Mr. Holloway, I presume." "Mrs. Brennan, we need to talk about Sarah Whitmore." "I have nothing to say to you." "Then listen. My family paid good money to clear her debts. She's obligated to nothing," Eleanor interrupted. "I'm her legal guardian. Any contract made without my consent is void. My lawyers disagree." "Then take it to court. Until then, leave her alone." Holloway's face hardened, and I saw something dangerous in his eyes. This wasn't just about money or contracts anymore. This was about pride, about being told no, about a woman who'd rather break his nose and run 300 miles than marry him. That kind of rejection burns. "Where is she?" Holloway asked, voice cold. "None of your business." "She's up there with him, isn't she? The old hermit, living in sin, dishonoring herself." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Sarah Whitmore is learning survival skills from an experienced teacher. What you choose to think about that arrangement says more about you than about them." Holloway took a step forward. His men moved with him. I stepped off the porch of the general store, Ezra beside me. Other folks appeared, casual-like, but there, mountain folks taking care of their own. Holloway noticed, stopped. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it won't end the way you think it will. Sarah Whitmore has protection now, legal and otherwise. You do well to remember that." Holloway stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'll remember. And when spring comes, when the pass opens, I'll be back, with enough men that your little community won't matter." He mounted his horse, looked down at Eleanor. "She's mine, one way or another. You tell her that when you see her." They rode off. Eleanor stood on her porch until they were out of sight. Then she came down the steps, walked over to where I stood. "We need to warn Jacob," she said. "Pass is still closed." Then we wait, and we prepare, because when that pass opens, trouble's coming. I nodded, and I thought about Jacob and Sarah up there in their small cabin, learning to love each other, building something fragile and precious. They had no idea what was waiting for them down below, no idea that their quiet winter was about to turn into something much more dangerous. Back at the cabin, Jacob and Sarah were learning what it meant to love someone when the world said you shouldn't. They didn't speak much about the kiss, about what had changed, but it was there in every glance, every touch, every moment of comfortable silence. Jacob still wore his wedding ring, but he found himself looking at it more often, wondering. Sarah watched him, waited, didn't push. One evening, Jacob finally took it off. He sat at the table, the ring in his palm, heavy with memory. Sarah was across from him, mending by firelight. "I need to tell you about Margaret," Jacob said. Sarah set down her mending, listened. Jacob told her everything, how they'd met, how she'd seen through his rough exterior to the man underneath, how they'd married young and been happy, how Annie had been born and made everything perfect, and then how the fever had taken it all away. "I buried them on a hillside," Jacob said. "And I put this ring on my finger and swore I'd never take it off, never love anyone else, never risk that kind of loss again." He looked at the ring. 23 years I've kept that promise." "And now?" Sarah asked softly. Jacob raised his eyes to hers. "Now I'm wondering if keeping that promise means dishonoring her memory, or honoring it." "What do you think she'd want?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "I think Margaret would want me to live, really live, not just survive." He stood, walked to the box where he kept the photograph, opened it, Margaret smiled up at him from the faded image, baby Annie in her arms. "I'll always love you," Jacob said quietly, speaking to the photograph, to the memory, to the ghost. "But I think you'd want me to love again, to be happy, to take the second chance I've been given." He placed the ring in the box beside the photograph, closed the lid gently. When he turned back, Sarah was watching him with tears in her eyes. "Come here," he said. She crossed the cabin, stepped into his arms. Jacob held her close. This woman who'd saved him without even trying, who'd given him back his life. "I love you," he said, the words rusty from disuse, but true. "I love you too," Sarah whispered. They stood together in the firelight, the mountains silent around them, the winter sealing them away from the world, and for that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the age difference, not what people would say, not the danger that waited down below, just this. Two people who'd been broken finding wholeness in each other. It wouldn't last. The world would intrude eventually. But for now, they had this, and it was enough. The next morning, Jacob found the boot prints. He was checking the trap line alone. Sarah had stayed back to work on tanning a hide. He saw them near the fourth trap, fresh, maybe a day old. Someone had been here, walking the same route Jacob walked every day, following his tracks, learning his patterns. Jacob's blood went cold. He looked around, scanned the tree line, saw nothing. But someone had been here. Someone was watching. Jacob ran back to the cabin, burst through the door. Sarah looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" "We're not alone up here anymore. Someone's been tracking us." He showed her the boot prints in the snow near the cabin, circling, watching. "Holloway's men?" Sarah asked, voice tight. "Maybe, or scouts for them?" Jacob's mind was racing. If Holloway knew where they were, he'd come. Maybe not until spring, when the pass was clear. But he'd come. And when he did, they needed to be ready. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Jacob looked at her, at this woman he'd fallen in love with, who'd come to him for protection. "We prepare," he said, "and we wait." Finding those boot prints changed everything. Jacob told me later that the moment he saw them, he knew their quiet winter was over. The world had found them, and it wasn't going to let them hide anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me back up to what happened next at the cabin. Then I'll tell you about what we were doing down in Pine Ridge, how we were getting ready for the storm we all knew was coming. After finding the tracks, Jacob spent the rest of that day securing the cabin. He checked every shutter, reinforced the door bar, made sure the rifle was loaded and within easy reach, set up a system where they'd take turns keeping watch at night. Sarah watched him work, didn't argue, just helped where she could. That evening, they sat by the fire, both tense, listening to every sound outside. "Tell me about them," Jacob said. "The Holloways, everything you know." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "James is the youngest son, 28 years old. He's lived his whole life in his father's shadow. The father, Colonel Marcus Holloway, he's a decorated war hero, rich, powerful. Everyone in Wyoming Territory knows the name." Jacob went still. "Marcus Holloway," he repeated slowly. "Colonel Marcus Holloway." "You know him?" Jacob stood, moved to the window, his mind racing back 30 years. "Wilson Creek," he said quietly. 1868. I was scouting for the 7th Cavalry. We got pinned down by hostiles. The colonel took a bullet meant for his men. I carried him 3 miles to safety." He turned to face Sarah. "I saved his life." Sarah's eyes widened. "James Holloway is the son of the man whose life you saved?" "Must be. Can't be that many Colonel Marcus Holloways." Jacob laughed, a bitter sound. "All this time I thought we were dealing with some spoiled rich boy. But if his father is the colonel—" He trailed off. "What does it mean?" "It means this is more complicated than I thought. The colonel was a good man, fair, honorable. If he knew what his son was doing, would he stop it?" Sarah asked. Jacob considered. "Maybe. But family loyalty runs deep, and I don't know what the colonel is like now. 30 years changes people." They were quiet for a moment. "There's something else," Sarah said, "something I haven't told you." Jacob waited. "When I broke James's nose, he said something. He said, 'You'll regret this. My father has connections everywhere. We'll find you wherever you run.'" Sarah met Jacob's eyes. "I think he meant it. I think his father might be helping him." Jacob felt the weight of that. If the colonel was backing his son's pursuit, they had more than money to worry about. They had political power, legal authority, the kind of influence that could make problems disappear, or make people disappear. "We need to get to Pine Ridge," Jacob said. "Talk to Eleanor, figure out what we're really up against. The pass should be clear enough by now. It's been almost 2 months. And we need supplies anyway." Sarah nodded. "When?" "Tomorrow. We pack light. Move fast. Get there. Get what we need. Get back." That night neither of them slept much. Jacob kept watch, rifle across his lap, listening. Around midnight he heard Sarah move. She came to sit beside him. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much thinking." They sat together in the darkness. The fire burned down to coals. "Jacob," Sarah said, "if they come for me, if they somehow get past you, past everyone, promise me something." "What?" "Promise you won't blame yourself. Promise you'll keep living. Not go back to hiding up here alone." "Sarah, promise me." Jacob took her hand, held it tight. "I promise, but it won't come to that." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not that man anymore, the one who runs, the one who gives up." He looked at her. "You changed me, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away." Sarah leaned against him, and despite everything, despite the fear and the danger and the unknown, Jacob felt something like peace. He wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came, they'd face it together. They left for Pine Ridge at first light. The trip down was easier than Sarah's trip up had been. Jacob knew the trails, knew where the drifts would be deep and where the ice was thin. Still took them most of the day. They reached Pine Ridge in late afternoon. The town looked the same as always, small, quiet. But Jacob felt eyes watching as they rode down the main street. People noticed. Of course they did. The hermit who lived alone for 20 years, riding into town with a young woman. Jacob could imagine the whispers starting already. They stopped at Eleanor's boarding house first. Eleanor came out onto the porch, took one look at them, and nodded. "Inside, both of you, now." She led them to her private sitting room, closed the door, turned to face them. "You know they've been here," she said. Not a question. "We found tracks," Jacob replied. "Someone's been watching the cabin." "It's worse than that." Eleanor pulled out a chair, gestured for them to sit. "James Holloway himself came to town 2 weeks ago with 8 men, threatened me, threatened the whole town if we didn't tell him where Sarah was." Sarah paled. "What did you say?" "I told him the truth, that you're under my legal guardianship, that any contract made without my consent is invalid. Showed him the papers your father filed." Eleanor sat across from them. "He didn't care. Said he'd be back when the pass cleared. Said he'd bring enough men that the community wouldn't matter." Jacob felt cold settle in his gut. "How many men?" "He didn't say. But if he's willing to bring an army—" Eleanor looked at Sarah. "This isn't just about the marriage contract anymore, is it?" "No," Sarah said quietly. "It's about pride. I humiliated him, broke his nose in front of witnesses, ran away rather than marry him. For a man like James Holloway, that's unforgivable." "There's more," Jacob said. He told Eleanor about the colonel, about Wilson Creek, about the connection he'd only just discovered. Eleanor's face went grim. "That changes everything. If Colonel Holloway is involved, we're not just fighting a spoiled son. We're fighting one of the most powerful men in Wyoming territory." "Would the colonel support this?" Sarah asked. "Chasing a woman who doesn't want to marry his son?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, "but we can't assume he wouldn't. Family loyalty is strong, especially among men like that." She stood, paced to the window. "There's something you both need to understand. The town is divided. About half support you. They see a young woman fighting for her freedom. They respect Jacob. They don't like being pushed around by rich outsiders." "And the other half?" Jacob asked. They see an old man and a young woman living alone in the mountains all winter. They think, well, you can imagine what they think. Jacob's jaw tightened. Let them think what they want. It's not that simple. Public opinion matters. If Holloway can paint you as some kind of predator taking advantage of Sarah, he might get sympathy, maybe even the law on his side. I would never, Jacob started. I know that, Eleanor interrupted. Sarah knows that. But strangers? People who don't know you? They see a 63-year-old man and a 24-year-old woman, and they make assumptions. The room was quiet for a moment, then Sarah spoke, clear and firm. Then we make the truth clear. I came to Jacob by choice. I stayed by choice. Everything that's happened has been by my choice. She stood, faced Eleanor. And I love him. Not because he saved me, not because I'm grateful, but because he's the best man I've ever known, because he's kind and strong and honest, because he makes me want to be braver than I am. Sarah turned to Jacob. I don't care what people think. I don't care about the age difference or the gossip or any of it. I love you, and I'm not ashamed of that. Jacob felt his throat tighten. He stood, crossed to her. I love you too, he said, loud enough for Eleanor to hear, loud enough to make it real. And I don't care who knows it. Eleanor watched them for a long moment, then she smiled. Good, because we're going to need that certainty in the days ahead. She moved to her desk, pulled out more papers. I've been making copies of the guardianship documents. Sent one to the territorial marshal in Willow Creek. Sent one to the district court. Sent one to the federal marshal in Denver. Why Denver? Jacob asked. Because if this goes badly, I want a record. Want someone outside Wyoming territory to know what happened. The colonel has influence in Wyoming, but less in Colorado. Eleanor handed Jacob a copy. Keep this with you. If Holloway's men come, you show them this. Make it clear Sarah is legally protected, that taking her by force would be kidnapping. And if they don't care about the law? Sarah asked. Eleanor's expression hardened. Then you defend yourselves, and the people of Pine Ridge will testify to whatever we need to testify to. Jacob understood what she was saying. If it came to violence, the community would back their story, would say whatever needed to be said to protect them. It was a gift and a burden. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. Eleanor looked at both of them. You need to decide what you want. Do you want to fight, or do you want to run? I'm done running, Sarah said immediately. Jacob nodded. So am I. Then we prepare for a fight, but we do it smart. We gather allies. We make sure the law is on our side, and we make James Holloway understand that taking Sarah will cost more than he's willing to pay. They stayed in Pine Ridge that night. Eleanor gave them separate rooms. For propriety, she said, though everyone knew they'd spent the winter alone together in a cabin. But appearances mattered, especially now. Jacob lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The room felt too small after months in the open mountains. Too enclosed. He thought about Sarah in the room next door, wondered if she was sleeping. Around midnight, he heard a soft knock. He opened the door. Sarah stood there in her nightdress, hair loose around her shoulders. I can't sleep, she said. Jacob stepped aside, let her in. They sat on the bed, not touching, just close. Are you scared? Sarah asked. Yes, me too. They were quiet for a moment. Jacob, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. What is it? Sarah took his hand, placed it on her stomach. I think I'm carrying your child. The world stopped. Jacob couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Are you sure? He managed. Not completely, but my monthly courses stopped. And there are other signs. I've been feeling sick in the mornings, tired all the time. She looked up at him. I think I'm about 6 weeks along. 6 weeks. That meant it had happened shortly after they'd first kissed, after Jacob had removed his wedding ring. A child. At 63 years old, Jacob was going to be a father again. The fear that gripped him was immediate and visceral. He'd lost Annie, watched her die in Margaret's arms. The thought of going through that again. I know you're scared, Sarah said softly. I'm scared too. But Jacob, this baby is a gift A second chance for both of us. Jacob pulled her close, held her tight. I'm too old, he whispered. You're alive. That's what matters. What if something happens to me? What if I die and leave you alone with a child? Then I'll raise our child the way my father raised me. I'll teach them to be strong, to be brave, to know they were loved. Sarah pulled back, made him look at her. But you're not going to die. Not for a long time. You're going to live to see our child grow up, to teach them everything you taught my father, everything you've taught me. Jacob wanted to believe her, but fear was a powerful thing. When this is over, he said, when Holloway is dealt with, we'll get married, make it legal and proper. I don't need legal and proper, Sarah said. I just need you. Well, I need it. I want our child to have my name. Want you to have my name. Sarah smiled. Then we'll get married, but not because we have to, because we want to. Yes. They lay down together, still clothed, just holding each other. Jacob placed his hand on Sarah's stomach, felt nothing yet, too early, but the child was there, growing, a future he'd never thought he'd have. I love you, he said. I love you too. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, safe for one more night. The next morning I found out about the baby. Eleanor told me, said Jacob and Sarah needed people they could trust, people who would stand with them when things got bad. I went to Eleanor's boarding house after breakfast, found them in the dining room, eating together. They looked different somehow, more settled, like they'd made a decision. Morning, I said. Jacob stood, shook my hand. Clayton, good to see you. You too. Eleanor said you had news. Sarah and Jacob exchanged a look. Then Sarah spoke. I'm pregnant, about 6 weeks along. I sat down, processed that. Well, I said finally, that complicates things. Or simplifies them, Jacob replied. Now there's no question about what we're fighting for. He was right. A child changed everything. Does Holloway know? I asked. No, and we're not telling him, not yet. He'll find out eventually. Let him find out after we've dealt with him, Jacob said. Right now, all he knows is that Sarah ran, that she's here with me. That's all he needs to know. I nodded, understood the strategy. What do you need from me? Help, Jacob said simply. When Holloway comes, and he will come, we need people willing to stand with us. You've got me. You know that. Thank you. We talked for another hour, made plans. Jacob and Sarah would head back to the cabin that afternoon. Stay there until the confrontation came. Meanwhile, I'd gather men I trusted, make sure we were ready. Eleanor would handle the legal side, keep the marshal informed, make sure there was a record of everything, and we'd wait. Because that's all we could do, wait for James Holloway to make his move. They left Pine Ridge around noon. I watched them ride out. Jacob tall in the saddle despite his years, Sarah beside him, strong and certain. They looked like partners, like equals. Not like predator and prey. Not like old man and innocent girl, like two people who'd chosen each other. I hoped the rest of the world would see it that way too. But I doubted it. Jacob and Sarah made it back to the cabin by nightfall. Everything was as they'd left it. No signs of intrusion, no new tracks. But the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, they barricaded the door, kept the rifle close, and they talked about the future. If it's a boy, Sarah said, I want to name him Thomas, after my father. Thomas Jacob, Jacob replied. If that's all right with you, it's perfect. And if it's a girl, Sarah smiled, Margaret Annie. Jacob felt tears sting his eyes. You don't have to. I want to. They were part of you, part of our story. The baby should carry their names. Jacob pulled her close, overwhelmed by love and fear and hope, all tangled together. I don't deserve you, he said. Yes, you do. You just spent 20 years believing you didn't deserve anything. Now you're learning different. She was right. Jacob was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning that life didn't end with loss, that love could come again, that 63 wasn't too old to start over. The baby growing inside Sarah was proof of that, a future neither of them had planned, but both of them wanted. Now they just had to survive long enough to see it. A week passed, then two. The weather warmed slightly. Spring was coming. Not here yet, but close. The snow began to melt. Streams ran with snow melt. Birds returned. And with the warming weather came riders. Jacob spotted them from a distance. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, searching. He grabbed the rifle, called Sarah inside. "They're here!" Sarah's hand went to her stomach. Protective. Instinctive. "How many?" "3 that I can see. Could be more." They watched from the window as the men approached. Stopped about 100 yards from the cabin. One of them called out, "Jacob Stone, we need to talk." Jacob recognized the voice. One of the men who'd been in Pine Ridge, the one with the scar. "What do you want?" Jacob shouted back. "Just to talk. No trouble." "Then talk from there." There was a pause. Then the scarred man dismounted, walked forward, hands visible and empty. He stopped 20 feet from the cabin. "Mr. Holloway wants his property back." "Sarah Whitmore isn't property," Jacob replied. "She's a person, under legal guardianship. Show him the papers, Sarah." Sarah held up the guardianship documents, made sure the man could see them. The scarred man squinted, didn't come closer to read them. "Mr. Holloway doesn't care about papers. He paid good money, made a deal. He expects that deal to be honored." "The deal was illegal," Sarah called out. "Made without my guardian's consent. It's void." "Take it to court then," Jacob added. "But Sarah stays here until a judge says different." The scarred man smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Mr. Holloway figured you'd say that, so he asked me to deliver a message." "What message?" "He knows who you are, Stone. Knows you saved his father's life at Wilson Creek. Knows the colonel speaks highly of you." Jacob felt ice in his veins. "So? So Mr. Holloway thinks it's a shame, a war hero like you reduced to this. Hiding in the mountains with a girl young enough to be your granddaughter, taking advantage of her desperation." "I'm not taking advantage of anyone," Jacob said, voice hard. "That's not how it looks. And when people hear about it, when they hear the whole story, they're going to wonder. They're going to ask questions, like what exactly have you two been doing up here all winter?" Sarah stepped forward, furious. "We've been surviving. He's been teaching me. And what we've done is our business, not yours or James Holloway's." The scarred man's smile widened. "So you admit you've been intimate. Good to know. That'll play well in court. Elderly man seducing a desperate young woman, using her vulnerability against her." "Get off my property," Jacob said. "Now." "I'm leaving. But Mr. Holloway wants you to know he's not giving up. He's writing to his father, telling him everything. The colonel's connections reach far. Maybe all the way to the territorial governor." The man started backing away. "You've got until the pass fully clears, maybe 2 weeks. After that, Mr. Holloway is coming with enough men to take what's his, legal or not." He mounted his horse. The 3 riders turned and headed back down the mountain. Jacob and Sarah stood in the doorway, watching them go. "He's going to tell the colonel," Sarah said. "Jacob's father. I know." "What will he do? The colonel?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't know. 30 years is a long time. He might side with his son, might use his influence to help him. Or he might be disgusted by what his son is doing, might stop him." "Which do you think is more likely?" Jacob was honest. "I think a father usually sides with his son, no matter what." Sarah's hand went to her stomach again, that protective gesture. "Then we prepare for the worst." "Yes." They went inside, barred the door, and they started getting ready for war. Down in Pine Ridge, word spread fast about the confrontation. One of the riders had stopped at the general store, made sure people heard his version of events. How Jacob Stone was holding Sarah against her will. How he'd taken advantage of her desperation. How James Holloway just wanted to rescue the poor girl from a bad situation. Not everyone believed it, but some did. The town divided further. I called a meeting, gathered the men I trusted. We met in the back room of the saloon. 8 of us, ranchers, trappers, men who'd known Jacob for years. "You all know why we're here," I said. "Jacob Stone needs help, and we need to decide if we're giving it. He's a good man, one of the trappers said. Kept to himself, but he was always fair, never cheated anyone. That was before he took up with a girl 40 years younger, another man countered. That changes things. Does it? I asked. Jacob's 63, Sarah's 24, both adults, both making their own choices. Why is it our business? Because it looks wrong, the man replied. And when things look wrong, they usually are wrong. Sarah came to him, I said, rode 300 miles looking for help. Jacob gave her shelter, taught her to survive. That's what happened. The rest is between them. Is it true they're living as man and wife? Someone asked. I hesitated, then decided honesty was best. They love each other, yes. And before you ask, they've been intimate. But it's not what you think. It's not some old man taking advantage. They're partners, equals. Partners, the skeptical man scoffed. He's old enough to be her grandfather. Age doesn't make love wrong, I said, and it doesn't make it right for James Holloway to come here with an army and take her by force. That got their attention. How many men is he bringing? The trapper asked. I don't know, but the threats were real. He means to take her, one way or another. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ezra Hawkins spoke up. He'd been listening quietly. I knew Thomas Whitmore, Sarah's father. He stayed at my store once, years back. Good man, honest, kind. He talked about Jacob Stone like he was a hero. Ezra looked around the room. If Thomas Whitmore trusted Jacob Stone with his daughter's safety, that's good enough for me. I'll stand with them. One by one, the others nodded. Not all of them. 2 men stood and left. Wanted no part of it. But 6 men stayed. It wasn't an army, but it was something. What do we do? The trapper asked. We wait, I said, and when Holloway comes, we make sure he knows he's not just facing Jacob. He's facing all of us. Back at the cabin, Jacob was teaching Sarah to shoot. She knew the basics. Her father had taught her. But Jacob wanted her better than basic. He set up targets at various distances, showed her how to account for wind, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. Sarah was a good student, patient, focused. After an hour, she was hitting targets at 50 yards consistently. Good, Jacob said. Now we practice from cover and in low light, and when you're scared. How do you practice being scared? I'll shoot near you, not at you, near. You need to learn to shoot when your heart is pounding, when your hands want to shake. Sarah nodded. All right. They spent 3 days practicing. By the end, Sarah could shoot almost as well as Jacob. Not quite, but close enough. I hope we never need this, she said. So do I. But hope isn't a strategy. They also worked on the cabin, reinforced the shutters, created firing positions at the windows, moved anything flammable away from the walls. And Jacob showed Sarah the tunnel. Tunnel? She asked. He pulled aside the rug in the bedroom, revealed a trap door. I dug this the first year I was here. Paranoia, maybe. But it leads out about 50 yards into the woods, hidden by deadfall. He opened it, showed her the narrow passage. If they surround the cabin, if there's no other way out, you go through here, take a horse and ride for Pine Ridge. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Sarah, I'm not leaving you, she repeated. We survive together or not at all. Jacob wanted to argue, but looking at her face, he knew it was pointless. Stubborn, he muttered. I learned from the best. Despite everything, Jacob smiled. The letter arrived in Willow Creek on March 10th, addressed to Colonel Marcus Holloway, delivered by private courier. The colonel was in his study when his aide brought it. He'd been reviewing accounts. The ranch was doing well, the cattle market strong. He opened the letter, began to read. His face went hard. Sir, the aide asked, is everything all right? The colonel didn't answer, just kept reading. The letter was from his son, James, explaining the situation, how a girl named Sarah Whitmore had been promised to him, how she'd fled to the mountains, how she was now living with a man the colonel knew, Jacob Stone, the cavalry scout who'd saved the colonel's life at Wilson Creek. The letter painted a picture, an old man taking advantage of a desperate young woman, using her need for shelter to seduce her, claiming love to justify his actions. James asked for his father's help, his influence, his connections, to bring Sarah back where she belonged. The colonel set down the letter, stared out the window of his study. He remembered Jacob Stone, quiet, competent, the kind of man who did his duty without complaint, who'd carried the colonel 3 miles with a bullet in his own shoulder. A man of honor. The colonel also knew his son, knew James's weaknesses, his tendency to feel entitled, his inability to accept no for an answer. The question was, which man was telling the truth? The aging war hero he'd once called the best scout in the cavalry, or the son he'd raised and loved despite his flaws? The colonel called for his horse. He had some investigating to do. March 15th. Jacob woke to the sound of horses, many horses. He grabbed the rifle, looked out the window. 8 riders, coming up the valley toward the cabin, and leading them was a young man on a fine horse, well-dressed. Handsome except for the crooked nose, James Holloway had come in person. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, "get the rifle. Take position at the other window." Sarah moved quickly. No panic, just cold efficiency. Jacob felt a surge of pride. She'd learned well. The riders stopped 50 feet from the cabin, spread out in a loose line. James Holloway dismounted, walked forward. "Sarah Whitmore," he called, "I've come to bring you home." Sarah appeared at the window, rifle visible. "This is my home, and you're not welcome here. You're under a legal obligation." "I'm under the guardianship of Eleanor Brennan," Sarah interrupted. "Any contract made without her consent is void. You have no claim on me." "My family paid good money." "Then take it up with my uncle. He's the one who stole it." James's face reddened. "You broke my nose, assaulted me. That's a crime. You tried to force yourself on me. That's also a crime." The men behind James shifted, uncomfortable. This wasn't going the way James had described it. James turned his attention to Jacob. "Stone, step out here. Let's talk man to man." "We can talk fine from here," Jacob replied. "You're hiding behind a woman?" "I'm protecting her." "There's a difference." James laughed, bitter. "Protecting her, is that what you call it? The whole territory will hear about this. The famous cavalry scout reduced to preying on desperate young women." "I haven't preyed on anyone." "Then what do you call it? She shows up at your door, vulnerable and alone, and you, what, offer her shelter out of the goodness of your heart?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. "And then what? You seduce her, convince her she loves you? An old man like you?" Sarah fired a shot, not at James, at the ground near his feet. He jumped back. The men behind him reached for their weapons. "The next one won't miss," Sarah said, voice cold. "Now get off our property." James stared up at the cabin, at Sarah in the window. "You're making a mistake. Your father saved my father's life," Sarah said. "If he's half the man mine was, he'll be ashamed of you right now." Something flickered in James's expression. Pain. Anger. "You don't know anything about my father. I know he's Colonel Marcus Holloway. I know Jacob saved his life at Wilson Creek. I know he's a decorated war hero." Sarah lowered the rifle slightly. "Does he know what you're doing? Does he know you're chasing a woman who doesn't want you, threatening violence to get your way?" James's face went pale. "My father supports me. Does he? Or did you lie to him the way you're lying to everyone else?" James stepped forward, furious. "I didn't lie about anything. You were promised to me. Your uncle signed the contract. My uncle had no right." "Then why did you run?" James shouted. "If you were so innocent, why run? Why hide up here with him?" "Because I knew you wouldn't accept no for an answer. You could have gone to the law. The law sides with men like you, men with money and influence. The law would have forced me to marry you just to avoid scandal." James was breathing hard now, losing control. "You think you're better than me, think you're too good for marriage to a Holloway, but you'll spread your legs for some old hermit?" Jacob fired, not at James, but close enough that the bullet whined past his ear. James dove to the ground. "The next one hits," Jacob said, voice deadly calm. "Now get on your horse and ride, and don't come back." James scrambled up, backed toward his horse, but his face was twisted with rage now, all pretense of civility gone. "This isn't over," he snarled. "My father will hear everything, and when he does, you'll both regret this." He mounted, wheeled his horse around. "I'll be back, with enough men that your mountain friends won't matter, with legal authority, with everything I need to take what's mine." The riders galloped off. Jacob and Sarah watched them go. "He meant it," Sarah said quietly. "I know." "What do we do?" Jacob set down the rifle, turned to face her. "We prepare, and we hope the colonel is a better man than his son." The colonel arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days later, alone, on a good horse, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself like the military man he'd been. He was maybe 70 now, white hair, mustache, ramrod straight posture despite his age. He stopped at Eleanor's boarding house. Eleanor answered the door, took one look at him, and knew who he was. "Colonel Holloway." "Mrs. Brennan, I believe we need to talk." They sat in Eleanor's parlor, coffee between them. The colonel got right to it. "My son wrote to me, told me about Sarah Whitmore, about Jacob Stone. I'd like to hear your version." Eleanor told him everything. The illegal contract, Sarah's flight, her arrival at Jacob's cabin, the guardianship papers. The colonel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back. "And the relationship between Stone and the girl? My son says—" "They love each other," Eleanor said simply. "Yes. Is that a crime? She's 40 years younger. She's an adult making her own choices." "My son believes Stone took advantage—" "Your son is wrong," Eleanor interrupted. "I've known Jacob Stone for 20 years. He's a good man, a decent man. He gave Sarah shelter when she needed it, protection, taught her to survive. And yes, they fell in love. That happens sometimes." The colonel was quiet. "I saved Stone's life once," Eleanor continued. "No, I'm sorry. He saved your life, at Wilson Creek." The colonel looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" "Jacob told us." He didn't realize the connection at first, but when he learned James was your son, Eleanor leaned forward. "Colonel, I don't know what your son told you, but the truth is simple. Sarah Whitmore doesn't want to marry him. She's legally protected under my guardianship, and she's chosen to be with Jacob Stone. Your son needs to accept that and move on." The colonel stood, walked to the window. "James has always struggled," he said quietly, "living in my shadow, trying to prove himself. I've made excuses for him, given him too much money, too much influence, too much freedom to make mistakes without consequences. He turned back, and now he's made one I can't ignore." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked. "I need to talk to Stone and to Sarah Whitmore. Hear it from them directly." "They're up at the cabin, about 10 miles. The trail is clear now." The colonel nodded. "I'll ride up in the morning, alone. I'd appreciate if you'd send word ahead. Tell them I'm coming to talk, not to fight. I'll send Clayton. He can guide you if needed." "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan." As the colonel turned to leave, Eleanor spoke again. "Colonel, your son threatened violence. Said he'd come back with enough men to take Sarah by force. You should know that." The colonel's face went hard. "He won't. I'll see to that." I rode up to Jacob's cabin that evening. Told them the colonel was coming. Jacob took the news quietly. Sarah looked scared. "What does he want?" she asked. "To talk. Eleanor thinks he's not convinced by his son's version of events. Wants to hear yours." "And if we tell him and he doesn't believe us?" Jacob asked. "Then we're in trouble. The colonel has connections everywhere. Could make your lives very difficult." Jacob and Sarah exchanged a look. "We tell the truth," Sarah said. "That's all we can do." "You should know," I said. "Sarah's pregnant." Jacob looked at me sharply. "How did you—" "Eleanor figured it out. Woman's intuition," she said. I looked at both of them. "Does the colonel need to know?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "Not yet. Let's see how this goes first." I nodded. Understood. The baby was their insurance, their final proof that this wasn't some sordid affair, but a real relationship, real love. But it was also a vulnerability, a target. Better to keep it secret for now. "I'll bring the colonel up tomorrow morning," I said. Be ready." The next morning, I guided Colonel Holloway up the mountain. He rode well for his age, kept pace without complaint. We didn't talk much, but about halfway up, he spoke. You know Jacob Stone? Known him 20 years. Good man. And the girl? I didn't know her before this winter, but Eleanor vouches for her. Says she's Thomas Whitmore's daughter. Thomas was a good man, too. The colonel was quiet for a moment. My son says Stone seduced her, used her desperation against her. Your son is wrong. How can you be sure? I looked at the colonel. Because I've seen them together. The way they look at each other. The way they move around each other. That's not predator and prey. That's partners. She's so young. Age doesn't make love wrong, Colonel, and it doesn't make it right for your son to chase her with threats and violence. The colonel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. We reached the cabin around mid-morning. Jacob and Sarah were waiting. Standing together on the porch, the colonel dismounted, looked at Jacob for a long moment. Stone. Colonel? 30 years fell away, 2 old soldiers facing each other. Then the colonel smiled, crossed the distance, held out his hand. Jacob shook it. It's good to see you, the colonel said, even under these circumstances. Same, sir. The colonel turned to Sarah. Miss Whitmore, I'm Marcus Holloway. I believe you know my son. I do. May I speak with you both? Hear your side of this? Sarah looked at Jacob. He nodded. Come inside, Sarah said. They sat at Jacob's small table. The colonel looked around the cabin. Simple, clean, cared for. Not the den of depravity his son had described. Tell me what happened, the colonel said. All of it. Sarah told the story. Her father's death, the debts, the uncle's betrayal, the forced contract, breaking James's nose, the flight to find Jacob. The colonel listened. Asked questions, sharp questions, like a man used to getting to the truth. Then Jacob told his side. Sarah's arrival. The winter, the lessons, the growing trust, and the love. I didn't plan it, Jacob said. Didn't want it. I'd spent 20 years making sure I never cared about anyone again. But Sarah, she changed that. He looked at her. She reminded me what it meant to be alive, not just surviving, living. The colonel was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. My son believes you took advantage of her, that the age difference makes this inappropriate. With respect, Colonel, your son is wrong. I'm 63, Sarah's 24. We're both adults, both making our own choices. People will talk. Let them. We know the truth. The colonel turned to Sarah. And you, Miss Whitmore, do you love him? Or do you just feel obligated because he helped you? Sarah didn't hesitate. I love him, not because he saved me, but because he's kind, strong, honest, because he makes me brave, because when I'm with him, I'm not afraid of anything. She met the colonel's eyes. I know what people will say. I know they'll judge us, but I don't care. Jacob is the best man I've ever known, and I choose him. The colonel sat back, studied them both. Then he sighed. My son won't accept this. We know, Jacob said. He'll keep coming, keep trying to force the issue. He's got my stubbornness, unfortunately, not always my judgment. The colonel stood. But he won't have my support. Not for this. Relief flooded Sarah's face. You'll stop him? I'll do more than that. I'll make it clear to James that this ends now, that you're legally protected, that any further action against you will have consequences. He looked at Jacob. I owe you my life, Stone. I haven't forgotten that. And I won't stand by while my son harasses the woman you love. Jacob stood, shook the colonel's hand. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. James is prideful, wounded. He may not listen even to me. The colonel moved toward the door, stopped. But I'll make sure the law understands the situation. Make sure the territorial marshal knows you're under my protection, both of you. He tipped his hat to Sarah. Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry for my son's behavior. You deserve better. Thank you, Colonel. After he left, Sarah collapsed into a chair. Is it over? She asked. Is it really over? Jacob wanted to say yes, wanted to believe the colonel's word would be enough. But he'd seen the look in James Holloway's eyes, the rage, the humiliation. Pride was a dangerous thing. I don't know, he said honestly. I hope so. The colonel rode back to Willow Creek that afternoon, called his son to his study. James came, confident, expecting support. The colonel stood at the window, didn't turn around. I went to see them, Stone and the Whitmore girl. Good. Then you saw, I saw two people in love, two adults making their own choices. James went still. Father, she was promised to me. The contract was illegal, made without proper guardianship consent. I've seen the papers, they're legitimate. But the money we paid was stolen by her uncle, not her fault. The colonel turned, faced his son. James, let this go. Let it go? She humiliated me, broke my nose, ran away. Because you tried to force yourself on her. Is that true? James's silence was answer enough. I raised you better than this, the colonel said, voice hard. Taught you to respect women, to accept no when you hear it, to have some goddamn dignity. She chose him over me, some old hermit. She chose a good man over a spoiled boy. Can you blame her? James flinched like he'd been slapped. I'm your son, and I love you, but I'm ashamed of you right now. The words hung in the air. Jacob Stone saved my life, the colonel continued. And even if he hadn't, what you're doing is wrong. Chasing a woman who doesn't want you, threatening violence to get your way, using our family name to bully people. He moved to his desk, pulled out a document. I've written to the territorial marshal, informed him of the situation, made it clear that any action against Stone or Miss Whitmore will be prosecuted as kidnapping and assault. Father, you can't. I can, and I have. This ends now, James. You leave them alone. You find another woman. You move on with your life. James's face was red, eyes bright with unshed tears. You're choosing him over me, your own son. I'm choosing what's right. There's a difference. James turned to leave, stopped at the door. You'll regret this. Is that a threat? It's a promise. You've humiliated me in front of everyone, sided with strangers over your own blood. You'll regret it. He left. The colonel stood alone in his study, wondering if he'd made the right choice, hoping his son would calm down, accept reality, move on, but knowing, deep in his gut, that James Holloway wasn't done yet, that pride and rage were a dangerous combination, and that the worst might still be coming. James Holloway didn't listen to his father. I learned about it later, pieced together from what the colonel told Eleanor, from what the hired men said after it was all over, from the fragments of a man's pride destroying him. 3 days after the colonel's visit to the cabin, James gathered his men, not in Willow Creek where his father might hear, but in a canyon 10 miles south, away from prying eyes. He had 12 men now, the original 8 plus 4 more he'd hired, hard men, the kind who didn't ask questions if the money was good enough. We ride tonight, James told them. Take her by force if necessary. Kill Stone if he resists. One of the men, the scarred one who'd been there from the beginning, hesitated. Your father said, My father is an old man, James snapped, living in the past, letting sentiment cloud his judgment. This is my decision, and I'm paying you enough to follow orders without question. The man nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes, doubt that should have warned James, should have made him reconsider, but pride doesn't listen to warnings. Jacob woke to the sound of horses, many horses, moving fast. He knew instantly this was different from before. This wasn't a negotiation, this was an attack. Sarah, get up now! She was awake immediately, grabbed her rifle. Jacob moved to the window, counted shapes in the darkness. 12 riders coming hard, surrounding the cabin. They're here, he said quietly. Sarah's hand went to her stomach, just for a moment. Then she squared her shoulders. What do we do? Jacob had been planning for this, preparing for weeks. We hold them off as long as we can. Give Clayton time to get here with help. How will he know? Eleanor was going to send someone to watch. If riders came this way, Clayton would know. It was thin hope, but it was all they had. The riders circled the cabin, stopped about 50 yards out. James Holloway's voice cut through the darkness. Stone, send her out, and this ends peacefully. Jacob didn't answer, just checked his rifle, made sure Sarah was positioned at the other window. I know you're in there, James shouted. I know she's with you. This is your last chance. Still, Jacob said nothing. Fine, James's voice rose. angry now. "We'll come in and get her." A shot rang out, hit the cabin wall. Warning shot. Jacob fired back. Didn't aim to kill, just sent a message. They were armed and ready. "You can't win this, Stone. There's 12 of us, and 2 of you. Save yourself, give her up." Sarah moved to the window, called out, "James, this is insane. Your father told you to stop." "My father doesn't control me. Then the law does. What you're doing is kidnapping. You'll go to prison. Not if there are no witnesses." The words hung in the cold air. Jacob felt ice in his veins. James wasn't planning to take Sarah and leave. He was planning to make sure no one could testify against him. He was planning murder. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, "get to the tunnel. Now. No, we fight together. Fight. We don't have enough ammunition for a prolonged fight, and they'll burn us out eventually. You need to go. Get to Pine Ridge. Tell them what happened." "I'm not leaving you. You're carrying our child." Jacob's voice broke. "Please, for the baby, go." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "If we're going to die, we die together." Another shot, this one closer, then James's voice. "Fire the barn." Jacob saw flames, the small lean-to where he kept his horses. Sam and Bertie. He'd had them for 15 years. "No," Sarah whispered. They heard the horses scream, then the pounding of hooves as the animals broke free, fled into the darkness. The barn went up fast. Dry wood, old hay, and the cabin was close. Too close. "Stone," James called. "You've got 5 minutes before the fire spreads. Send her out or burn." Jacob looked at Sarah. At this woman he loved more than his own life. "The tunnel," he said. "Both of us. Now." She nodded. They moved quickly. Jacob pulled up the trap door, grabbed the emergency pack he'd prepared. Ammunition, food, blankets. "You first," he said. Sarah lowered herself into the narrow passage, started crawling. Jacob took one last look at his cabin. 20 years of his life, the place where he'd hidden from the world, where he'd found love again. Then he followed Sarah into the darkness, pulled the trapdoor shut above him. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for a man Jacob's size. He'd dug it himself, one shovelful at a time, years ago when paranoia had driven him to prepare for every possibility, now that paranoia might save their lives. He crawled after Sarah, the earth close around them, roots brushing his back, the smell of damp soil. Behind them, faintly, he heard shouting, the crack of the cabin door breaking, men discovering the cabin was empty. "Faster!" Jacob urged. Sarah was struggling. The passage was easier for her smaller frame, but she was pregnant, tired, scared. "I can't." "You can. Just a little further." They emerged into the cold night air, hidden by deadfall and brush. Jacob had chosen the exit point carefully. You couldn't see it from the cabin, couldn't see it unless you knew exactly where to look. They crouched there, catching their breath. Behind them the cabin was burning now, flames reaching for the sky. Jacob's heart broke watching it. But at least they were alive. "This way," he whispered. He led Sarah through the forest, moving quiet, using every skill he'd learned in the cavalry, every trick of survival he'd mastered in 20 years. They'd gone maybe a quarter mile when they heard pursuit. Dogs. James had brought dogs. "Run," Jacob said. They ran, through the dark forest, over fallen logs, through patches of snow that still lingered in the shadows. Behind them, the dogs bayed, getting closer. Sarah stumbled. Jacob caught her. "Keep going. I'll slow them down." "Jacob, go. Head for the creek. Follow it downstream. The water will hide your scent. I'll catch up." He pushed her forward, turned back, drew his rifle, waited. The dogs appeared, 3 of them, big hunting hounds. Behind them, men on foot. Jacob fired, not at the dogs, at the ground in front of them. They yelped, scattered, confused. The men took cover. Jacob ran, caught up with Sarah at the creek. "In the water, now." They waded into the freezing stream. The shock of cold stole their breath, but it would hide their scent, give them a chance. They moved downstream, knee-deep in ice water, every step agony. After maybe a mile, Jacob pulled Sarah onto the bank. "We need to get warm, or hypothermia will kill us faster than Holloway." He found a dense stand of pines, built a hasty shelter with fallen branches, got Sarah under it. Then he did something he'd learned in the cavalry, something he'd never thought he'd need to use again. He built a Dakota fire pit, a small, nearly invisible fire that gave heat without giving light, without smoke that could be seen from a distance. It took precious minutes, but it might save their lives. Sarah was shivering violently, her lips blue. Jacob stripped off her wet clothes, wrapped her in the dry blanket from the pack, held her close, sharing body heat. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Stay awake." "Cold." "I know, but you're going to be fine. We're going to be fine." He wasn't sure he believed it, but he said it anyway. They huddled together in the darkness, the tiny fire giving just enough warmth to keep them alive. And they waited for dawn. Down in Pine Ridge, I woke to pounding on my door. The watchman Eleanor had hired, young ranch hand named Billy. "Fire!" he gasped. "Up at Stone's cabin. And riders! Lots of them!" I was on my horse in minutes, grabbed my rifle, fired 3 shots in the air, the signal we'd arranged. Within 20 minutes I had 8 men, including Ezra, the marshal from Willow Creek, even Eleanor, riding astride like a man. "What happened?" the marshal asked. "Holloway attacked. We need to get up there, now." We rode hard, pushed the horses as fast as we dared in the darkness, reached the cabin just as the sun was rising. The cabin was gone, just smoldering ruins, the barn completely destroyed, and James Holloway stood in the center of it all, looking lost. His men were scattered, looking for tracks, for signs of where Jacob and Sarah had gone. I rode right up to James, my rifle pointed at his chest. "Where are they?" "I don't know. The cabin was empty. They're gone." The marshal rode up beside me, his badge visible. "James Holloway, you're under arrest for arson, attempted kidnapping, assault." "I didn't." "You burned a man's home, brought an armed gang to attack him. Multiple witnesses saw you leave Willow Creek with these men." James looked around, at his hired men, at the ruins of the cabin, at the disaster his pride had created. "My father—" "Your father is the one who sent me," the marshal said. "He knew you wouldn't listen, knew you'd do something stupid, so he asked me to follow you, to stop you before you did something you couldn't take back." The marshal's eyes were hard. Too late for that now. He gestured to his deputies. They'd been hanging back, waiting. "Arrest him, and his men. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Arson. We'll sort out the rest in court." As the deputies moved in, James screamed, "She's mine! The contract was legal! She owes me!" "Nobody owes you anything," the marshal said quietly, "and the sooner you understand that, the better." James lunged, tried to run. One of the deputies tackled him, wrestled him to the ground. The fight went out of him then. He just lay there, in the mud and ash, crying. It wasn't pretty to watch a grown man reduced to this, but I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt sorry for Jacob and Sarah, wherever they were. "We need to find them," I said to Eleanor. "They went toward the creek," one of Holloway's men said. The scarred one. He stepped forward, hands raised. "I didn't sign up for murder, just wanted the money. But when he said to burn them out," the man shook his head. "I tried to tell him, tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen." "Where exactly?" Eleanor demanded. "East, toward the creek. Stone has some kind of escape tunnel." They went through it while we were breaking down the door. I felt relief wash through me. They'd escaped. But relief was tempered by worry. Where were they now? Were they safe? "Spread out," I ordered. "Search parties. They're on foot. Probably cold and wet if they went through the creek. We need to find them before—" "Before what?" Eleanor asked. "Before they died of exposure," I thought, but didn't say. "Before they worry themselves sick," I said instead. We split into groups, searched. It was Eleanor who found them. Mid-morning, in a stand of pines about 2 miles from the cabin, Jacob had built a shelter, a fire, had Sarah wrapped in blankets. Both of them were alive, exhausted, half frozen, but alive. "Thank God," Eleanor breathed. I helped Jacob to his feet. He was shaking. From cold or relief, or both. "Sarah is fine," Eleanor said. "I've got her. Clayton, help me get them on horses. We need to get them warm. Now." We brought them back to Pine Ridge. Eleanor put them in her best room, built up the fire until it roared, made them drink hot soup, made them sleep. They slept for 16 hours straight. When Jacob finally woke, I was sitting by the bed. "What happened?" he asked, voice hoarse. I told him. James arrested. The cabin destroyed. The colonel sending the marshal. "It's over," I said. James is going to prison. The colonel made sure of it." Jacob closed his eyes. "The horses?" "Sam and Bertie made it out. Someone found them this morning. They're fine." "The cabin?" I hesitated. "Gone, Jacob. I'm sorry." He nodded. Didn't speak for a moment. "We're alive," he said finally. "That's what matters." Sarah stirred, woke, saw Jacob. "You're all right," she said. "So are you." She placed her hand on her stomach, fear in her eyes. "The baby is probably fine," Eleanor said from the doorway, "but we'll have the doctor look at you to be sure. Just rest now." Sarah relaxed, let her eyes close. Jacob took her hand, held it, and I left them there, together, safe, for now. The trial was brief. James Holloway pleaded guilty to arson and attempted assault. The kidnapping charges were dropped in exchange for his plea. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in territorial prison. Colonel Holloway sat in the courtroom, watched his son led away in chains. When it was over, he approached Jacob and Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for my son, for everything." "Mem?" "It's not your fault," Jacob replied. "Isn't it? I raised him, made excuses for him, gave him too much without teaching him responsibility." The colonel looked at Sarah. "Miss Whitmore, my family will compensate you for the cabin, for the losses you suffered. It's the least we can do." "We don't want your money," Sarah said. "Nevertheless, you'll have it. Consider it payment for the suffering my son caused." He turned to leave. Stopped. "Stone, that debt I owed you, from Wilson Creek. Consider it paid. We're even now." "We were always even, sir." The colonel smiled sadly. "No, but we are now." He left. Jacob and Sarah stood in the courthouse, free. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Jacob pulled her close. "We live. We build. We love each other." "Where?" "Wherever you want. The cabin's gone. We can rebuild. Or we can go somewhere else. Start fresh." Sarah thought about it. "I want to rebuild. Up there, where we fell in love, where we learned to be brave together." Jacob nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." The rebuilding took 3 months. I helped. So did Ezra. So did half the town of Pine Ridge. Turned out when you stood up to a bully, people respected that. And Jacob and Sarah had earned that respect. We built the new cabin on the same spot. Bigger this time. 2 rooms, a proper loft, better windows, stronger door. Jacob worked alongside us. 63 years old and keeping pace with men half his age. Sarah worked too. Despite her growing belly, preparing meals for the work crew, planning the layout, making it a home. By early June it was finished, and on June 15, 1889, they got married. Eleanor officiated. She'd gotten herself deputized as a justice of the peace just for the occasion. I stood as Jacob's witness. Ezra stood for Sarah. It was a small ceremony, just friends, just people who mattered. Jacob wore new clothes, store-bought for the occasion, looked uncomfortable in them. Sarah wore a simple dress, white cotton, her belly visibly rounded now. She was beautiful. They said their vows on the porch of the new cabin, the mountains rising behind them, the sun setting in shades of gold and purple. "I, Jacob Stone, take you, Sarah Whitmore, to be my wife, to love and honor, to protect and cherish for whatever time we're given." His voice shook, but it was strong. "I, Sarah Stone, take you, Jacob Stone, to be my husband, to love and honor, to stand beside, to build a life with, for as long as we both shall live." Eleanor smiled. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride." Jacob cupped Sarah's face in his work-roughened hands, kissed her gently. We all cheered. It wasn't fancy, wasn't grand, but it was real, it was true, and it was earned. After the ceremony, we had dinner. Eleanor had brought food. The women of Pine Ridge had contributed. There was more than we could eat. We sat around on the porch and in the cabin, talking, laughing. Jacob sat with Sarah's hand in his, looking more content than I'd ever seen him. "Thank you," he said to me, "for everything, for standing with us. You'd have done the same, maybe, but I'm grateful anyway." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Are you scared?" I asked. "About being a father again?" "Terrified," Jacob admitted, "but also hopeful. This baby is a second chance. For both of us." He looked at Sarah, at her hand on her belly. "I won't waste it." Thomas Jacob Stone was born on September 23, 1889. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, dark hair, his mother's eyes. The labor was hard, 18 hours. The doctor from Willow Creek came up to help, but Sarah was strong, and the baby was healthy. Jacob held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He's ours," Sarah replied. "I visited a week after the birth, brought supplies, wanted to see how they were managing. The cabin was warm, smelled like milk and wood smoke and new life." Jacob was carving a new wooden horse, smaller than the one he'd made for Thomas all those years ago. "For the baby," he explained, "when he's old enough." Sarah sat by the fire, nursing little Thomas, looking tired but radiant. "How are you?" I asked. "Exhausted, happy, terrified. All of it." "That's parenthood." Jacob set down the carving, moved to sit beside Sarah. "You want to hold him?" I took the baby, carefully. It had been years since I'd held one so small. He looked up at me with those dark eyes, Sarah's eyes, Thomas Whitmore's eyes. "He's got the family look," I said. "He does," Jacob agreed. "Sarah's father would have been proud." "He is proud," Sarah said softly. "I know he is." I stayed for dinner, left as the sun was setting, rode down the mountain thinking about family, about legacy, about second chances. Jacob Stone had spent 20 years hiding from life. Now he was living it, fully, completely. It was something to see. The years passed. I visited regularly, watched little Thomas grow. He was a bright child, quick to laugh, curious about everything. Jacob taught him the same things he'd taught Thomas Whitmore: how to track, how to read sign, how to respect the land. But he also taught him gentleness, patience, things Jacob had learned from Sarah. Sarah taught the boy to read, to write, to think about the world beyond the mountains. They were good parents, patient, loving, present. When Thomas was 3, they had a daughter, Margaret Annie Stone, born in the spring of 1892, smaller than her brother, quieter, but fierce in her own way. Jacob was 66 when she was born, but he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I thought I'd never get to do this again," he told me. "Never thought I'd have a second chance at being a father." "You're doing good, Jacob." "I'm trying. That's all any of us can do." In the winter of 1896, Jacob got sick, started as a cold, turned into pneumonia. He fought it, was stubborn, refused to admit how bad it was. But by February, we knew he wasn't going to make it. Sarah sent for me, asked me to come. I rode up through the snow, found Jacob in bed, thin, pale, struggling to breathe. But his eyes were clear. "Clayton," he said, voice weak, "save your strength." "For what?" "I'm dying. Might as well use what I've got left." He gestured to a chair. I sat. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Take care of them, Sarah and the children. They'll need help. The cabin, the land. Just make sure they're all right. You know I will." Jacob nodded, closed his eyes for a moment. "I had 7 good years," he said. 7 years I never thought I'd have. That's more than most men get. It's not enough. No, but it's what we get. And I'm grateful for it." He looked toward the other room where Sarah was putting the children to bed. "She gave me back my life, made me believe in second chances, in love, in hope." His voice broke. "I wish I had more time. Wish I could see the children grow up, see what they become. They'll remember you. Sarah will make sure of it. I know. Jacob took a shuddering breath. Tell them their father loved them, that every day with them was a gift. Tell them yourself. Jacob smiled weakly. I will. But after I'm gone, remind them. Don't let them forget. I won't. Sarah came in then, sat on the edge of the bed, took Jacob's hand. The children are asleep. Good. They sat in silence for a while, just holding hands. I stood to leave, give them privacy. Clayton, Jacob said, thank you for everything. Rest well, my friend. I left them there, together. Jacob Stone died 2 days later. February 18th, 1896. He was 70 years old. Sarah was with him at the end, holding his hand, telling him she loved him. He died peacefully, in his sleep, in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by the family he'd never thought he'd have. We buried him on the hillside above the cabin, the same hillside where he used to sit and watch the sunset. Sarah carved the headstone herself. Simple words: Jacob Stone, 1826 to 1896, beloved husband and father. He taught us to be brave. Below that, she added something else. Something that made me tear up when I saw it, reunited with Margaret and Annie, and watching over Sarah, Thomas, and Margaret. It was perfect. Sarah stayed in the mountains. I offered to help her move down to Pine Ridge, offered to find her a house in town where life would be easier. She refused. This is our home, she said, mine and Jacob's. I won't leave it. So she stayed, raised the children alone. I helped where I could. So did others from town, but mostly Sarah did it herself. She ran the trap lines, hunted, provided for her family, taught the children everything Jacob had taught her. Thomas grew up to be a fine young man, strong, kind, smart. He went to college back east, studied natural sciences, then came back to Colorado, became a forest ranger, protected the mountains his father had loved. Margaret became a teacher, married a good man, had children of her own. Sarah lived to see her grandchildren, to tell them stories about their grandfather, about the hermit who'd learned to love again, about the second chance that changed everything. She died in 1924, at the age of 60, buried beside Jacob on that hillside. And now here I am, 78 years old, writing this story by lamplight. My hands shake, my eyes blur, but I remember. I remember that winter of 1889, when a young woman rode 300 miles through snow to find an old hermit, when two broken people found wholeness in each other, when love proved stronger than fear. I've lived a long time, seen a lot, lost people I loved, buried friends, watched the world change in ways I never imagined, but I've never seen anything quite like what Jacob and Sarah had. That courage to love when everyone said you shouldn't, that strength to choose each other despite every reason not to, that faith that second chances are real, that it's never too late, that love doesn't care about age or convention or what the neighbors whisper. My grandchildren will read this. They'll think it's a fairy tale, an old man's imagination. But it was real. I was there. I saw it all. And I learned something from watching them. I learned that running from pain doesn't heal it, that isolation isn't the same as safety, that the biggest risks sometimes bring the greatest rewards. I learned that love can come at any time, at any age, in any form. And when it does, you don't question it. You don't analyze it. You don't worry about what people will say. You just hold on, and you're grateful. Jacob Stone spent 20 years in those mountains, hiding, running, convinced his life was over. Then Sarah Whitmore showed up with a wooden horse and her father's last words. And everything changed. They had 7 years together. Not enough. Never enough. But they were 7 good years. 7 years of love and laughter and family. 7 years of truly living instead of just surviving. That's more than a lot of people get in a lifetime. Jacob understood that. At the end, he told me he was grateful, not bitter that he had so little time, but grateful for the time he had. That's the lesson, I think. Not to focus on what we've lost, or how much time we have left, but to be grateful for what we're given, to love hard, to be brave, to take the second chances when they come, even if they scare us. Especially if they scare us, because that's what living means. I visited the graves yesterday, rode up that mountain one more time. Don't know if I'll make it up there again. The years are catching up with me, but I wanted to see them, to tell them this story was written, that their grandchildren would know the truth. The graves are well kept. Thomas and Margaret Stone make sure of that. 2 simple headstones side by side, looking out over the valley. The cabin is still there, empty now. The children keep it maintained. But nobody lives there anymore. It stands as a monument to love, to courage, to second chances. I stood there for a while, in the cold, looking at those graves, and I said what I'd come to say. You did good, Jacob, both of you. You took your second chance and you made it count. Your children are good people, your grandchildren too. The legacy you left isn't just in them, it's in everyone who heard your story, everyone who learned that it's never too late to start over. The wind whispered through the pines, cold but not cruel, and for a moment I could almost hear Jacob's voice, gruff but warm. Thank you, old friend, for remembering, for telling it true. And Sarah's voice, strong and clear. Tell them we were happy. That's all that matters. We were happy. I will, I thought. I have. I mounted my horse, started down the mountain, looked back once, at the graves, at the cabin, at the peaks rising sharp against the winter sky. Beautiful. Deadly. Home. This is the West, I know. Not gunfights and gold rushes, not outlaws and sheriffs, but this, 2 people choosing each other, building a life, loving hard in a hard land. That's the real frontier, the real adventure. The courage to open your heart when everything tells you to keep it closed. The strength to love when loving means risking loss. The wisdom to know that the pain of loneliness is worse than the pain of potential heartbreak. Jacob and Sarah understood that. They lived it. And they left behind something precious. Not just children and grandchildren, but proof that second chances are real, that redemption is possible, that it's never too late to choose love over fear. I'm finishing this by lamplight. Outside, snow is falling, first snow of winter. Makes me think of that November morning in 1889, when Sarah Whitmore rode into Pine Ridge asking directions to Jacob Stone's cabin, when everything began. My hands are shaking now, can barely hold the pen, but I wanted to finish, wanted to write it down before the memories fade, before I join Jacob and the others on whatever hillside awaits. This is the last page, the last words. So let me say this, to my grandchildren, when you read this, when you're old enough to understand, don't be afraid to love, even when it's complicated, even when people don't understand, even when you think it's too late or too soon or too different. Love anyway, love hard, love honest, love brave. Because in the end, that's all we have. The people we loved, the moments we shared, the courage we showed when fear told us to run. Jacob Stone taught me that. So did Sarah Whitmore. So did Thomas and Margaret and all the others who lived and loved in these mountains. They're gone now, all of them. But what they built, the love, the family, the legacy, that remains. And it will remain long after I'm gone too. Long after you're reading this wondering if it was real. It was real. I promise you it was real. And it was beautiful. Clayton Pierce, Pine Ridge, Colorado, December 15th, 1899. The journal entry ended there. Clayton died 3 months later, March of 1900, peacefully in his sleep. They found the journal in his desk, along with other papers, letters, photographs. His grandchildren read it, just as he'd hoped they would, and they passed it down, through the generations, until it reached me, Clayton's great-great-grandson, living in a world he couldn't have imagined, with challenges he never faced. But reading his words, I understand something. The core of being human hasn't changed. We still need love, still need connection, still need courage. We still need to know that second chances are possible, that it's never too late to start over, that love doesn't have an expiration date. Jacob and Sarah proved that. Clayton witnessed it. And now I'm telling you, in case you need to hear it. In case you're hiding in your own mountains, running from your own pain. In case you think your best years are behind you. They're not. Not if you're still breathing. Not if you're willing to be brave. Not if you can open your heart one more time. The wooden horse that started it all, the one Jacob carved for young Thomas Whitmore, still exists. It sits in a museum in Denver now, part of a frontier exhibit. The placard reads, "Wooden horse hand-carved, circa 1872, symbolizes the connection between Jacob Stone and the Whitmore family." Part of the famous Winter Reckoning story, tourists walk past it every day. Most don't stop, but some do. Some read the placard, read the story, and they understand. Love transcends time, transcends age, transcends everything we think limits us. All we have to do is be brave enough to accept it. I visited Jacob and Sarah's graves last summer, drove up into the mountains, parked at the trailhead, hiked the last 2 miles. The cabin is gone now, collapsed under a century of snow, but the graves remain on that hillside. Looking out over the valley, I stood there, just like Clayton did in 1899. And I said what he said. You did good, both of you. Your story matters. People still need to hear it. The wind whispered through the pines, and I could almost hear them. Jacob's gruff voice, Sarah's strong one. Thank you for remembering. Tell them we were happy. Tell them it was worth it. I will. I have. And now it's your turn. To take the wooden horse, the symbol of love and legacy and second chances. To carry it forward. To remember that somewhere in the Colorado mountains, a hermit learned to love again. And a young woman learned to be brave. And together they proved that the best chapters of our lives might still be unwritten, even when we think the story is over. Even when we're convinced we're too old, too broken, too late, there's always another page, another chance, another beginning. All we have to do is turn the page and begin.